So, welcome back to my channel, Fiction Star. The series name is, What If Naruto Teleported in Attack on Titan and Married with Annie Leonhardt? So do not wasting any more time, let's start the video. Mikasa Ackerman ran as hard and as fast as her legs would carry her, chest heaving and hitching for breath, sobs tearing at her throat, tears scouring her eyes raw and red. Her long black hair kept getting in her eyes when she ran, but she daren't stop to bind it up for fear of being discovered. All around her, Shiganshina District 8 town of the outermost wall, Maria, was in chaos. Because that wall had been breached, everyone was being slaughtered, eaten, devoured, and they, as humans as people, were all but helpless to prevent it. There were simply too many. All around her, the town burned. She didn't care. The death of her adoptive mother, Aaron's mother, was all too fresh in her mind, blotting out all else, devoured by that titan, her body bitten in half, swallowed in a single gulp. She tried to keep it together, she really had, but she'd just been so frightened, so scared, and so she had run, until she and Aaron somehow got separated from the others in the chaos, from everyone else that might have been able to protect him. They were only 9. There was no way they could possibly fight against any of these monsters. There was just no way. Boom! Heart-pounding, Mikasa dared to risk a glance over her shoulder, eyes wide. A titan stood there in the distance, towering over a nearby building, eyes narrow, its mouth gaping wide. Beside her, Aaron gasped, mirroring her thought. Had it seen them? Grah! It had. Slowly, then with ever-increasing frequency, it started to pound after them, the earth shaking with each step. Still Mikasa ran, and Aaron alongside her, knowing they couldn't possibly outrun this monster, and yet knowing they must. Live. Aaron's words from long ago echoed in her mind, telling her to run, demanding that she run, that she escape. Then she stumbled and fell, her foot catching upon a cobblestone, sending her skittering into Aaron, sending them both sprawling. The impact must have knocked him out. He must have struck his head, because her adopted sibling didn't move after that. But Mikasa had no time for such thoughts, because the titan was nearly upon them now, its footfalls growing closer with each step, its giant fingers splayed wide. Time itself seemed to slow. In a motion that seemed to last several minutes rather than a single second, a black and orange blur descended upon the titan's unprotected backside and swarmed up its hide. A man? Twin knives kunai glittered in his hands, their purpose obvious, their deadly edges singing a song of death, as their owner seemingly ran up the slippery slope that was the titan's back before leaping upon its shoulder. Recognizing the sudden weights on its back, the behemoth began to turn, but it was already too late. The man reversed his grip on the daggers and struck. Twin knives plunged into supple flesh. Once, twice, 3 times, the assailant struck down without brutal precision, slashing across the beast's only vulnerable spot in a series of brutal crosscut that left the titan reeling, clutching at the gaping wounds, the one area it had forgotten to protect. Neck. Looking back, everything only appeared to be moving slowly. In reality, the man had struck 7 times in less than a single second, faster than the human eye could comprehend, and yet Mikasa, with adrenaline surging through her young veins, had seen it all. She saw him kick off the titan's shoulder and launch backwards, his body contorting in a flawless flip. He wasn't wearing motion gear, but that was absurd. He'd taken down the titan with only a pair of knives. Impossible. Ridiculous, even. There was just no way he could have. Oh, Mikasa's mind went blank as the titan's corpse teetered, rocking back and forth on its heels, as though it couldn't decide which began to fall. Its jaws still hung open, as though determined to devour her in its last seconds of life. She knew she should run, that she ought to flee from this place before she was eaten and meet up with Aaron. But her mind was inexplicably filled with fear as she looked into the hate-filled eyes of her would-be killer. Just then, she caught sight of that strange blur in her peripherals again. Get down! Her knees scraped against the ground as her body rolled and tumbled across the cobblestones, sending a hot flash of pain through her legs. Pain that meant she was alive then, that she hadn't been eaten. Her mind was only just now catching up with what she'd seen, her brain processing the impossible death of the 15-meter beast. Gradually she became aware of arms wrapped around her, a body shielding her from harm. He let go of her then, and she scrambled backwards, her mind awhirl. What was happening? How was she still alive? Why was she covered in blood? Where was? Easy there, lass, a rough voice soothed her thoughts. You've had a nasty fall. Slowly, warily, Mikasa craned her neck upwards, turning her head in the direction of her savior. He was young, Mikasa was certain of that much, couldn't have been more than 17 years old, maybe 18 at the most. Ragged blonde locks shaded his whiskered face, concealing bright, sapphire eyes and an overly gracious smile deep beneath his bangs, and yet his eyes seemed old, somehow jaded, hollow, even. An old, traveling cloak hung over his shoulders, beneath which the ruined remnants of an old black and orange jumpsuit could be seen, wafting in the breeze summoned by his arrival in the courtyard, and he was covered in Titan blood. It stemmed from his sternum and shoulders like a fine mist, and thankfully there was none upon his face, but still, he must have finally seen the fear in her eyes, because he began to clean himself with his cloak. Only then did she notice Eren, slung over his shoulder. Finally, when their rescuer seemed certain there was no longer any blood on his personage, he bent to a knee and faced her, unshouldering her sibling. When he turned, the light of the setting sun glinted of the metal plate wrapped around his head. It was a headband, worn by many of his kind, but Mikasa didn't know that, not yet, so instead she held her breath and braced for the worst. Imagine her surprise when he nodded, checked his pulse and sighed. "He'll be fine," were the first words she heard out of his mouth. Then he turned his attentions upon her. "Are you all right?" he asked, trembling. Mikasa managed a nod. "No need to act tough," he observed with a small smile. "What's your name?" Mikasa. "Mikasa?" The man's smile grew another inch. "That's a nice name. Mine's Naruto. Nice to meet ya." His gaze shifted to Eren's slumbering form. "And this is?" "Eren, your brother." It was not a question. Hi, Mikasa could feel an icy calm settling over herself, her fear replaced by a cold certainty. "You killed that Titan back there, didn't you?" "Titan." His face crumpled. "So that's what they're called?" He hazarded a look at the still steaming corpse. "There were a ton of them out there, so is that why you have all these walls? To keep these things out?" He indicated the still standing perimeter of stone that surrounded the city, a wall that had protected them for many years. For all the good it had done them thanks to the colossal Titan. Everyone was dying because of that brutal beast and its mindless machinations, because it had let those other Titans in. Then his words stabbed at Mikasa's psyche, penetrating her cold fury. "Out there?" She blinked, curious. Despite her ire, he wasn't from beyond the wall, was he? "Did you come from outside?" "Well, I certainly don't live in here." Naruto flung a hand for the destruction surrounding them. A knife fell from his sleeve and clattered to the floor at her feet with a clang of steel. It was one of the very same knives he'd used to butcher the Titan with before. Mikasa grabbed it almost on instinct. "You dropped this," she offered, handing it to him. "Oh, that?" The blonde laughed at that. It was a soft, amusing sound. She rather liked it. "You can keep it. I have plenty of 'em." And on that note, without pausing to even glance over his shoulder, he flung a kunai backwards. The kunai simply materialized in his hand, flung and thrown before Mikasa even recognized the weapon. Before she could think to ask just what he was doing, Naruto did something with his fingers and suddenly there were more of them. Many, many more. She was about to say he'd wasted his weapons when a massive Titan lumbered into view, stumbling right into his line of fire. It staggered as the kunai struck it in the back of the head, blinked, turned its gaping maw. "Katsu," Naruto whispered as he crouched over Eren and Mikasa, making a fist with his right hand. "BKRM." Mikasa felt, rather than saw the actual explosion. Everything shook around her, threatening to throw her from her feet, were it not for Naruto. The blonde's body was the sole shield against the fire and flames that rose up to swallow them whole, leaving the inferno to ripple harmlessly around them. When the smoke finally cleared, they were covered in soot and silt but still very much alive and for the most part, unharmed. At least the unconscious Eren and Mikasa were. Naruto, however. "Ah, Kami, these are gonna leave a mark." Mikasa barely stifled a scream when she saw the ruined state of the blonde's back. Shards of sharp stone wedged between flesh and bone. His visage was set in a tight grimace as he stood. With a grunt he reached down and began pulling the deadly spikes out of his back one by one, seemingly uncaring for his own gaping wounds. "Ow, ow, ow!" Naruto was hissing by the time he pulled the last stone spear from his spine. "That's what I get for using so many explosive tags." When Mikasa tried to get a better look at his injuries, she lost her breath. In place of what she thought to be gaping wounds, there were now only the slightest of cuts, and even as she looked on, those two began to heal as though they'd never been. The only proof that they'd ever existed were the gaping holes in his cloak, and she half expected those to vanish as well. This was all so surreal. "Stop gawping," Naruto thumbed her mouth shut. "It's rude. You act like you've never seen a Jinchuriki before." Mikasa hadn't. She didn't even know what a jinchuriki was. Another explosion of cannon lit the city square before she could speak, showering them in smoke. Naruto frowned. Let's get you and your brother out of here, Misaka-chan, he decided. I'd hate to have you get eaten after going through all this. Without breaking stride, Naruto bent down and scooped her and Eren up into his arms, pulling them tight to his chest. Hold tight now. That chest alongside the entirety of his body was abruptly engulfed in a strange golden glow, stemming from head to toe. Their rescuer grunted a warning, and then the world fell away from the three of them. Indeed, the landscape itself seemed to blur in and out around them. It took Mikasa several seconds to realize her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. Naruto was simply running at an insane rate of speed. Fast. This was Mikasa's only thought before the air was subsequently sucked from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath. It came back to her in short order only to be taken away yet again at the sight unveiling before her young eyes, because Naruto was running, leaping, catapulting them forward. It didn't seem possible that a human being could move so swiftly, yet here he was, vaulting over buildings as though they were naught but pebbles in his path. They swept past hundreds of titans in the span of several seconds, blurring by them before the behemoths could even think to reach out and pluck their prey from the rooftops. In some cases Naruto simply barreled right through the enemies, his golden cloak serving as an impenetrable barrier, an almighty shield that thrust towering titans aside whenever one of them dared to bear their path. At other times his cloak sprouted arms and appendage which he used to vault over the cruel creatures, ending their lives in the blink of an eye. Out of the corner of her eye she couldn't quite see what with her Naruto blocking her vision, but she was fairly certain made another strange gesture with his hands, crossing both fingers before him even as he held them with his arms, and as Mikasa Ackerman looked down she bore witness to yet another miracle. Out of the air, appearing from nothingness, were dozens of Narutos, 24 in number, but how was that possible? He'd simply made more of himself. If Naruto noticed her confusion he said nothing. Instead he barked orders at his clones. There could be no other word for them, issuing commands in the blink of an eye. Some he dispatched to aid in the evacuations, others were sent to exterminate the titans. The remaining 7 gathered around them in a protective phalanx, their golden bodies a shield against whatever dared come their way. They advanced more slowly now. The shinobi's agility was just a memory now compared to their current pace. Mikasa continued to look on, unable to give voice to the sudden swell of emotion surging in her chest. Why, was this stranger saving them? What did he possibly hope to gain from their safety? And why did her face feel so hot? Thankfully, Eren chose that moment to stir, forcing the thought to be broken. Era? Naruto skidded to a halt, the sudden momentum of which nearly jarred the 2 children from his arms. You awake, Gaki? Eren muttered something incomprehensible, to which Naruto frowned. Come again? Don't wanna wikupiate. Naruto's response was to strike him over the head with an open palm. Kozo! Speak properly so I can hear you. It wasn't a hard blow by any means, but it was more than enough to return her brother to the world of the waking. Eren jerked free of Naruto's grasp and flopped to the street, clutching the rising welt upon his head. If the situation hadn't been so dire, Mikasa might have found it funny. As it were, she continued to watch the conflict unfold from Naruto's grasp. It simply hadn't occurred to her to ask to be put down yet, that was all. It had nothing to do with wanting to be held. Itai! He yelped, glaring bloody red daggers at the blonde. What was that for? To knock some sense into you. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Can you walk? Good. Without further ado he began to usher her brother along ahead of them. This way, this way. He ushered them under the gate, ignoring the confused glances of the military as the portcullis ponderously edged ever closer to closing. An errant glance caused the clones to slow then stop altogether. Much to Mikasa's disbelief, the doppelgangers moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men and women, the last line of defense against the oncoming titans. Mikasa murmured her thanks as he finally lowered her to the ground and ushered her onward after Eren. They were nearly there, edging past the guards, almost to safety. Good evening, gentlemen. Naruto inclined his head politely as he stepped inside the arch. It's a fine day to die, isn't it? Who are you? One of them challenged him, reaching for their blade. Ally or enemy? Me? The blonde tilted his head aside. HRM, I guess you could call me a friend. He made as if to move past them, uncaring of the hostile gazes fixated upon his back. Abruptly he paused. Why aren't you out there? He asked one of the guards. Huh! I said, why aren't you out there? Naruto continued. Isn't it your job to protect these people? The men shrank back from his gaze. Be because it's safer here? Someone murmured. It was like flicking a switch, like an iron trap. Naruto's gaze locked onto the man's own, stifling all warmth in the air. The sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression was enough to silence the entire room. Nothing moved, nothing at all, and then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter. Tell that, he growled, to the children dying in these walls. Without another word he continued onward, leading them out of the darkness of the arch and into the light. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, Mikasa started at the sight. She could see the boats. She could even see Armin on one of them. But they were too far away, much too far, and at this rate. Alrighty then, Naruto grunted, hoisting her up by the scruff of the neck and into the air. An errant glance confirmed he had done the same with Eren. 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Mikasa blanched. Naruto, he couldn't possibly be planning on. And here we go! He was. 2 more! Naruto bellowed, and before Mikasa could think to protest, he flung her and Eren, hard. They'd just enough time to see the river blur beneath them before they struck the hard, unyielding decks of the boat, landing in a tangle of arms and limbs. A cry of surprise went up from her brother. He hadn't been expecting this. Neither had she. Armin was suddenly there beside them, quick to help them to their feet even as Mikasa struggled to get her bearings. You made it! He exclaimed. Yeah, Eren replied sullenly. Mikasa sympathized. Now that the chaos was behind them, she truly had time to think about it. The death of their mother. It pressed down on her like a weight now, a heavy burden, harsh and cruel, threatening to obliterate all thought, all save one. Naruto? Over here! Clambering to her feet, she scanned the many faces crammed into the boat, half expecting to see Naruto amongst them. But the blonde's whiskered face was nowhere to be seen. In fact, his voice had sounded incredibly distant just now. Eren was likewise searching for the blonde, but for different reasons than Mikasa's own. Where the hell was that bastard? How dare he throw them like that in dispensary? He owed him a kick to the shin. Naruto! Mikasa called once, expecting him to pop up at any moment, but he did not. Isn't that him? Armin pointed out. Mikasa wanted to ask just how her friend knew Naruto, but that train of thought found itself obliterated seconds later. Imagine her surprise when she finally caught sight of Naruto in the distance standing on the shore. He stood there, tall and proud, refusing to turn his back but at the same time, making no move to distance himself from the growing chaos behind him. Wait a minute? Wasn't he getting on the boats? If he didn't hurry he'd be left behind. Sorry, this is where we part ways. He waved back at them with a kindly smile. It's been fun. He craned his head and looked away. That kind smile and those tattered rags did nothing to distract her from what came next. However, the wall burst, as if he'd expected it to, and a massive titan came barreling through. Unlike its other brethren, its body was sheathed in armor from head to toe, and it was coming closer, pounding forth in a rising cloud of debris of steam. It showed absolutely no sign of stopping. Nay, it could not, would not stop, and Naruto stood right in its path. Mikasa marveled at him as he doped a bracing stance, spreading his legs apart, sandaled feet burrowing into the concrete, and then it happened. She felt a change in the air. Had she been closer she might have seen his eyes narrow into the golden slits and orange eyelids that so defined his favorite technique, Sage Mode. Without pause or preamble he raised a hand, palm upright. There was nothing significant of the gesture, no massive exuding of power. He simply extended his right arm, held it there, and the armored titan found itself stopped in its tracks, cold. Naruto budged not an inch, though the street burst beneath their feet and showered them in debris. Though the massive monstrosity strained and snorted at him, his body stood strong and all too still, an immutable pillar that refused to move or bend to his opponent's will. His voice rose over the chaos, growing louder with each passing second. Killing innocent people, butchering little children, just what the hell do you guys? The blonde raised his gaze then, and even from here, Mikasa realized something was wrong. Think you're doing? With a colossal heave, her savior grabbed the titan and heaved, flinging the behemoth over his shoulder, as though it weighed no more than a child. The vicious judo throw served its purpose. Naruto's sudden counter sent the armored titan crashing to the ground, well away from what had once been the gate. The survivors screamed at the sight, scrambling away from the clash even as the titan struggled back to its feet. Naruto was there, rising in the air to greet it. A single punch sent his adversary careening back towards the gate in a shower of stone. How had he done that? Mikasa wondered. He'd done something no man should be capable of, a feat impossible for a mere mortal. He knocked a titan back with his bare hands? Ora! At the sound of Naruto's scream, Mikasa's head snapped back and forth like a puppet severed from its strings. Naruto? Yash, the blonde murmured, bracing himself for the worst as his opponent dug itself out of the rubble. Let's do this, Kurama. Not at full size though, don't wanna crush everything. Golden light engulfed him as before, but this time it didn't stop there. It shot upward and outward from him like a beacon, blanketing the setting sun in 7 different shades of crimson and saffron. Mikasa looked on helplessly, awed as the blinding radiance took hold of the blonde's form and shook it, warping his body into something massive, something monstrous. Sapphire snapped into scarlet. Fangs grew where there had once been teeth, spreading his visage into the muzzle of a beast. Hair changed into golden fur and grew rapidly cover his skin, leaving him to droop onto all fours. 9 tails of pure, nascent energy sprouted from his back and flayed the earth to ribbons. Claws dug deep into the soil and ripped up great gouts of earth, flinging chunks of it into the air, one of which reduced an unlucky man to a mere stain upon the land. All the while Naruto was growing, changing, until he towered over them, so much like the armored titan itself. Mikasa gawped up at it. This beast that had once been a man, was this really Naruto? How had he become such a beast? How had he gone from a mere man to something so monstrous? Raya warg! The fox, for it could be nothing else, opened its mighty maw and roared, an air-splitting cry that shook both heaven and earth, not one to be outdone. The armored titan answered the fox's cry with another of its own, a deafening knell rising up beneath his, causing everyone to clench their ears in a vain attempt to stifle the sound. Unaffected by the blast, the beast that Naruto had become rose, standing on its haunches to appraise its armored adversary, row upon row of razor-sharp teeth splitting in an eerie grin. "Hello, dinner," it snarled. There was a moment of stern silence as they beheld one another, and then the fox pounced. One moment it stood stationary upon the soils of the land. The next, it erupted upward with a mighty lunge of its hindquarters, rising to tackle the titan up and into the hole through which it had first emerged. The earth groaned beneath their impact, sending guards scattering from their cover, uncertain as of whom to attack. Both monstrosities were up in an instant, and it was then that Mikasa realized just how much at a disadvantage Naruto's bijou form truly was. Although he was clearly much more nimble than his larger adversary, he lacked the armored platings and the endurance that marked his opponent. He seemed to realize this even as she thought of it, and bounded forward again, swarming his opponent before it could break into another bone-jarring charge. It all happened so fast. One moment they were rolling around on the ground, clawing and tearing at one another. The next, the fox's fangs finally found purchase upon the titan's right arm, biting down with enough force to shear clear through the armor and muscle to the bone beneath. And then it was over. Mikasa recognized the sick pop-pop-pop of dislocation, and then the monster's arm was simply gone, flopping away from them in a shower of gore. The titan spat something unintelligible at him, its eyes wide with anger and perhaps a touch of fear. They circled one another, titan and fox, fangs bared, either willing to make the next move. In the end, the Jinchuriki did. Naruto/Kurama kanonied forward, slamming into the titan like a freight train. There came a mighty oomph as the monster's armored spines slammed into the west wall, leaving it stunned. But not out of the fight by any means. It could still recover and continue. Naruto didn't give it those means. Even as his armored adversary struggled to right itself, his fox-like form was already there, looming overhead like a fierce, implacable kami come to wreak righteous judgment. Despite its own fear, his opponent puffed out its chest and roared. Grarar! The titan never finished that roar. Jaws of pure, coalescent energy closed around the beast's neck and proceeded to shake it like a rag doll. The armor upon its neck began to boil and crack, splintering away beneath those man-sized teeth. It seemed to recognize its own impending doom. The titan did, because its remaining arm struck at the kitsune time and time again, armored knuckles stabbing into the fox's unprotected snout until finally, Naruto was forced to let go, lest he risk the breaking of his own nose. Yelping, he seemed to retreat, momentarily cowed by his opponent's strength. The armored titan chose its moment to advance, and the beast that Naruto had become loosed a roar of his defiance, presenting the giant with a terrible view of the rising tide of black fire in the back of its throat. To its credit, the titan tried to draw back from the blast. It really did. Naruto simply wasn't having any of it. 9 tails coiled around the beast's remaining arms and legs, drawing it forward. Holding it fast, 4 paws clamped around its torso, and still the Baijidama swelled larger in the back of the blonde's throat. Incredibly, he locked eyes with Mikasa in that moment before he unleashed hell upon the Titan and himself. She could see the other Titans crowding in and around him, grasping at his body, at his form. But despite that, the kitsune held fast. Despite the Titans tearing at its fur and devouring its flesh, the kitsune smiled. A voice plucked at her thoughts, whispered into her mind, "See ya around, Mikasa-chan." And then he was gone into the fire. Her last sight of him was that of the explosion. It consumed both kitsune and Titan alike, the sheer shockwave of which rocked the boat even as it rounded the bend and left what had once been their home far behind. Eren watched it go with tears in his eyes, still lost in the memory of his dearly departed mother. Damn those Titans! He hated them. Hated them. Why did they have to ruin everything like that? Devour everyone for the sheer pleasure of it. He'd get them. One day, he would kill them all. "I swear I'll annihilate all of them." His sister's thoughts dwelt on a different subject as their home drifted further and further out of sight. A touch of sorrow plucked at her heart. Naruto was dead. Had to be. There was no way anything, Titanic or otherwise, could have survived a blast of such proportions. Even now she could see the flames roiling high into the distance. Naruto was gone. And even if he wasn't, he was trapped in a city surrounded by Titans. There was no ways he, even with all his formidable skills, could survive. Yes, he was probably dead, just like her mother, just like. Silent and bereft, she laid her head down upon the deck, uncaring of the hardwood floor. Despite her grief, sleep came quickly, ensorcelling her in the sweet mire of her dreams. She dreamed of happier times, of a time before the Titans, when she thought the world was a kind and gentle place. And so Mikasa Ackerman slept, and she slumbered, quietly wondering at the young man's fate, unknowing that she'd soon see him again. 3 years have passed since that fateful day. Eren applied for military training that year, as did Mikasa and Armin. Each expected hard times ahead for the next 3 years. What they weren't expecting was to meet an old friend. At least Mikasa wasn't. Now more than 13 years of age, she stood stock still with her brother and childhood friend row for row in uniform, rigid and unflinching as their instructor welcomed them in typical military fashion. "You are now officially members of the training unit No. 104. Said instructor, a dark-eyed, intimidating man, barked at them. "Unfortunately for you, I, Keith Shardis, will be in charge of you maggots starting today. As will my lieutenant Uzumaki Naruto." The only indication of this lieutenant was a slight nod to an adjacent rise on the nearby mesa. Mikasa jumped at the mention of that name, but when she turned to look, no one was standing there. Had she just imagined hearing his name then? Inexorably, the instructor continued, "We aren't here to give you a warm welcome. All of you are now merely livestock, waiting to be eaten by Titans. No, you're even worse than livestock. For the next 3 years, we'll train you useless shits. We'll teach you how to fight the Titans. When you face one in 3 years, will you still be just food? Or will you become a glorious wall to protect these walls? Or a mighty champion of mankind who will destroy the Titans? That is for you to decide. The choice lies in your hands." Without another word, he strode forward to address his recruits. "You there?" "Yes, sir." "Who the hell are you?" he demanded of Armin. "I'm Armin Arlert, sir." The boy replied without fail. "I'm from Shiganshina, sir." "Sure you are." Shadis roared back. "Good name for a retard. Your parents call you that?" "My grandfather, sir." "Arlert, why are you here?" "To contribute to mankind's victory, sir." "Fucking splendid," the instructor declared, seizing Armin by the shoulders and spun him about. "You'll make fine Titan feed." Line 3. About face. With that, he moved on to the next line. "And who the hell are you?" he asked of the next recruit. "Sir." "I'm Thomas Wagner, sir." "I'm from Trost, sir." "Speak up." "I'm Thomas Wagner, SI. Can't hear you." "Come back after your balls drop." Without pause or preamble, he moved on to the next group. Line 4. About turn. A whiskered visage pulled the slightest of smiles as it watched the instructor move on to the next line of recruits, and continued his verbal assault. Uzumaki Naruto almost laughed at the sight. He had high hopes, for this generation. There was so much raw potential here. Some of them would make fine soldiers. Others might become fine scouts, and still others showed the inherent talent to become shinobi. Indeed, Naruto had held high hopes for these youngsters, high hopes indeed. 3 long years had passed since his return to the walls. Having survived his scuffle with the Titans, he'd followed the river and eventually found his way to civilization. Making for himself a defunct home here amidst the denizens of Wall Rose, word of his heroism in Shiganshina had spread like wildfire amongst mankind. He'd become something of a man-made legend to these people now, a man who could take on the form of a giant kitsune, create copies of himself and summon the wind with a flick of his fingers. Some said he was a god and worshipped him as such, others called him a devil and feared him even more than the scourge that plagued their very race, god and devil. Naruto considered himself to be either. He was, after all, only human. Ah, the irony of that statement. Were it not for the demon within him, he'd never have survived being catapulted to this god-forsaken future, never have awoken to find these detestable giants. After all, he thought to himself, I'm only human, and this human had come all this way just to see these greenhorns. With his powers and prestige, he could have easily landed a cushy position protecting the king or serving some other human noble. Instead, he'd chosen to take the bull by the horns literally and figuratively. Less than a week from now, he would be an unofficial part of the Scouting Legion. He had no idea how to use the 3D maneuver gear. No, he refused to use it, and yet for reasons unbeknownst to himself now, he wanted to work with them. These fools who dared to venture beyond the walls to fight the Titans. He'd even turned down the garrison corps and the military police just so he could join said fools in their fight. But that was neither here nor there. Right now, and for the next 3 years, he would help train these whelps, or die trying. He might even make a shinobi out of 1 or 2 of them, if they had the right aptitude and assuming they had the proper chakra coils to activate. Who knows, given enough time and the right resources, he might be able to recreate his people from scratch. Then he wouldn't be alone anymore. Whoa there, tiger! Naruto slapped his cheeks before he became too caught up in his dreams for the future. Agelessness aside, he had all the time in the world. Some of them, the recruits below him, might not even make it through the week. Still, to think he'd find himself here, staring down at all these fresh young faces. This was so nostalgic. It reminded him of his early shinobi days, before the threat of war loomed on the horizon, before Sasuke's defection, before Orochimaru, before all of that, back when he was so desperate to become a ninja, so proud to wear the hishiate, it almost brought a tear to his eye. Most of these children had no idea what lay in store for them, no idea of the horror a Titan could inspire, and yet they were throwing themselves in to become soldiers anyway. That set them in one of 2 groups, ridiculously brave, or hopelessly stupid. In the case of the former, he could work with them, but if they were the latter, as he secretly suspected, Che, he thought to himself, listen to yourself, Naruto, you're being sentimental again. These kids can't stand up to a Titan as they are now. Certainly not the one you fought. You mean the armored Titan? Been a while, Kurama, he chortled to himself. Did you enjoy your 3-year nap? HRMPH, the kitsune yawned. Maybe if you'd done something interesting I would have woken up sooner. Naruto cocked his head aside, smiling at the word reverberating inside his head. Now, most would have considered him crazy for talking to himself, but he wasn't crazy. Okay, maybe a little, but that didn't make the voice inside his head any less real. Kurama, the 9-tailed fox, was as much a part of him as he was it. Ever since he'd unlocked the seal deep within him, they'd ceased to be 2 separate entities. Now they were one, dual souls sharing a single body. 2 spirits, in one flesh, sharing the same chakra. Apparently eternal youth was a side effect of their union. That, or they looked ridiculously good for 117 years. Their dirt nap must have done wonders. Youthfulness aside, do you really think that giant is here somewhere? He's here all right, Naruto replied, narrowing his gaze upon the population at their feet. I can smell him. And at least 2 others. It was true, just had to be. He diligently spent the last 3 years after the breach of Maria hunting down titans, sharpening not just his killing skills. Sleeping for a century tended to make one a bit rusty, but his sensory capabilities as well, and his nose told him that the armored behemoth was somewhere within these walls, possibly even amongst these recruits. But so far he had yet to see hide nor hair of him. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? A Titan shifter? The last shinobi shrugged. It's possible, I guess. I mean, we gained that ability 3 years ago, didn't we? And you know how much I hated you using it. His partner chastised. You went completely berserk last time. No use lying there. It must have had something to do with ingesting all that Titan blood during their battle. He'd discovered the ability purely by accident. Having been without food for nearly a week, forced to wander by the river, pissed off and angry at himself, wanting more than anything to just find something to eat, anything. Somehow or another he tripped and stumbled, his hand catching upon a jagged piece of rock and sliced his thumb open. Just like that, he transformed, morphing into the very creatures he'd been hunting. Thankfully he hadn't been anywhere near Wall Rose at the time. His memories of the incident were still hazy, but Kurama's remained crystal clear. His body had gone from man to monster, shifting into a 20-meter monstrosity more than 5 meters larger than those 15-meter titans. If anyone saw him like that, they'd have freaked out. In the end, he devoured an entire pack of wolves before Kurama had finally been able to wrest himself out of their temporarily rampaging body and stop him. Naruto shivered at the thought. He had no desire to ever revisit that form again, not unless he absolutely had to, unless he was forced to face the colossal titan. Ugh, there was a battle he didn't relish fighting. He was confident he could control this newfound power of his if he set his mind to it, but at the same time he was afraid of losing himself to that form again. If that ever happened, there would be no holding back. He hadn't used his full power during the breach of Wall Maria, for fear of destroying the town, reducing his Biju form to merely a fraction of its full size during his short-life scuffle with the armored titan. Perhaps if he'd used all of his strength back then, mankind wouldn't be in the mess it was now. No, there was nothing he could do about that now. He'd rescued those 2 runts back then. In addition to countless others, he'd done what he could at the time, and now there was nothing to do but live with the consequences of his actions. Best just to watch and see who had the most potential, stupidity or otherwise. Line 5. About turn. It went on like that for hours, and in that time Mikasa finally realized something. The instructor had ignored her and Eren completely, alongside a handful of other recruits. Perhaps this was because they too had already suffered their rite of passage 3 years ago? He simply glanced at them in passing until finally he came to one Connie Springer. He promptly began to haranguing the young cadet for saluting on the wrong side of his chest. Honestly, who did that? Mikasa almost felt sorry for him. Poor kid. The crunch of a potato being bitten interrupted them. All eyes turned towards the perpetrator. A young brunette lass with dark eyes, she seemed to be scarfing down the potato as if her life depended on it. Perhaps it did. Judging by the look on her face, it might have been at least a week since her last meal. Shotties promptly dropped Connie. Everyone froze. Even Mikasa felt just a touch uncomfortable when she recognized that fearsome gleam in the instructor's eye. Oh, that poor girl. "Oh, you there?" he growled, approaching the potato girl. "What are you doing?" In response, the girl glanced around and took another bite. "I am fucking talking to you, cadet!" Shotties bellowed. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" Sasha Browse, sir. "I'm from the southern Wall Rose village of Dopper, sir." Sasha Browse, "What is that thing in your hand?" "Sir," she said with a salute. "It's a potato, sir." "I can fucking see that, cadet." The instructor bellowed. "Why are you eating it?" "I saw it in the kitchen and it looked delicious, sir." "So you stole it?" "Why? Why would you choose to eat it now?" "Potatoes are much more delicious when they're hot, sir." "I thought I should act swiftly." "Ho? Is that so? Well, in that case you can run swiftly for the next 3 hours. Era, can't you go easy on her, Shotties-san?" A familiar voice drawled somewhere behind and above the line. "Poor thing looks like she's about to drop dead from hunger." The instructor offered a small snort in reply. "You're too soft, Naruto." Mikasa bristled. She knew that name. And now that voice. But it couldn't be. It could possibly be. It was. Her gaze swung upward. There she found him, standing above them all on a slight rise. Naruto laughed as he stepped off from the cliff, his body plummeting like a sinking stone to the canyon floor miles below. Mikasa's breath caught in her throat. Was he insane? That was a 50-foot drop. He'd be killed or worse. She watched, helpless, as her savior dropped towards them feet first, his body standing stiff and rigid, a spear falling down from the heavens, gliding through nothingness as though he'd been born there, and he wasn't even wearing maneuver gear. Surely, such a drop should have spelled his doom. His boots sank into the stone, leaving a slight impression upon the earth as he alighted effortlessly amongst the recruits. His recruits. Everyone made way for him warily, each uncertain of his sudden intrusion. but none dared challenge his presence, this unannounced arrival, not here in the presence of the instructor. He hadn't changed a bit, Mikasa noted. No, perhaps that wasn't entirely true. For starters, it looked like he'd finally taken a bath. Those spiky blonde locks were still mangled and unruly, but at least they weren't caked with grease and grime as they'd been when last they'd met. Naruto appeared rested as well, another stark contrast with the exhausted fighter that had rescued her and Eren all those years ago. He'd since swapped his tattered rags out as well, exchanging those battered garb for that of a military uniform and trench coat, and he looked absolutely at home in both. There was a slight swagger to his step, one that all but screamed it's good to be back. Then there was the gleam in his eyes, one that said these next few years just might prove to be perhaps the most painful days they'd ever endured, and the instructor did nothing to question his presence. If anything, Keith Shadi seemed to welcome it. Hell! That was a slight smile on his face, wasn't it? What was going on here? Naruto-san? Mikasa exclaimed in disbelief, her eyes tearing. Despite herself, despite knowing what the instructor would do, she broke rank and bolted towards him. Is that you? Is that really you? For his part, Naruto didn't reprimand her, he simply stared back at her in sheer disbelief. It was only when she grabbed him, when she flung her arms around him, that the shinobi finally reacted. A velvety grunt leapt from his lips, his arms shooting out to catch her by the shoulders, drawing her back as though he were afraid she might somehow attack him despite not having a weapon. Who the hell are you? He demanded with a growl. Mikasa's heart sank into her throat. He didn't recognize her? Well, that wasn't surprising. Oh, baka! Eren hissed, but his warning fell on deaf ears. What are you doing? Get back in line! Mikasa wasn't listening. It's me! She argued back at the blonde holding her. Mikasa, what are you talking about? Wait. Blue eyes bulged, recognition dawning in their aquamarine depths. Mikasa? You're that chibi I rescued back in Shiganshina. He grinned then, and Mikasa felt her heart skip a beat. I almost didn't recognize you after all these years. You've gotten bigger? How's your brother? Is he around here? Cammy, he was asking too many questions. And he seemed to realize it too, because he held out a hand to stifle his own mouth. Wait, never mind that. What the hell are you doing here? Don't tell me you decided to become a soldier because of... I decided to become a soldier on my own, Mikasa found herself admitting in a murmur, her body squirming beneath his piercing gaze. I thought that if I did I might be able to see you again, somehow. Well, that was partially true. She'd known he was alive for at least a year now. Her hoping and praying must have paid off somehow. Tales of a fox slaughtering titans were rather hard to miss. After all, his survival ever since he'd saved her had never been called into question. But to suddenly see him here, standing before her after 3 years, it was almost too much to bear. Oi, seriously? Those two? I didn't know they had a relationship like that. Murmurs erupted around her. Mikasa gave them no thought whatsoever. She only had eyes for the scarred, smiling blonde standing before her. Because he was alive. Alive! Standing here before her unharmed after all these years. She'd thought him to be dead. And he hadn't changed in the slightest. Aside from a few new scars on his face and forehead, her savior appeared virtually ageless. He was still 17 going on 18, still the same youth that had saved their lives that fatefully day in the Shiganshina district. Although the age gap had shrunk to 4 years on her end, he hadn't aged a day. But how was that possible? Seriously, kid? Naruto was still incredulous. She could see it in his face. You wanted to see me? A complete stranger? You're not a stranger. Her cheeks were burning now despite her insistence. Mikasa desperately pushed her boot into the dirt as though she could somehow bury what she felt there. You are, that is to say. Cammy, what was wrong with her? Why was she feeling so flustered? She just wanted to thank him. Right. If so, then why did she feel this strange pressure in her chest whenever she looked at him? What was going on here that had her so out of sorts? Frustrated tears brimmed at the corners of her eyes, increasingly aware of the unwanted attention. You don't need to say any more. Narutop's calloused hand reached down to ruffle her hair, gently tousing those ebony locks. You were happy to see me, right? I guess that's what's important. Mikasa's head jerked up in a flash, just in time to catch the slightest of smiles on his whiskered visage before it disappeared entirely. And then it was gone. But putting that aside, now that you are here, there's something I should say. It was then that the blonde flashed her a grin that looked more at home on a demon than any man. Get back in line, maggot. Oh, she had the succinct feeling she wasn't going to enjoy this. Not at all. Now get! As if to confirm her thoughts, the blonde gave Mikasa a harsh and unexpected shove, thrusting her back to her place in line. Mikasa reluctantly took the hint, and stepped back beside her brother. Ignoring the confused stares of her foster brother and fellow cadets, she directed her gaze back to Naruto's, only now realizing why he turned so crass. On a sudden, here, Naruto wasn't her savior. He was her superior officer, and as such, he had an example to set. There could be no favoritism from him. He couldn't afford to be seen doing such things here in front of all these fresh, impressionable faces. But even so, that push had hurt, just a little. His gaze caught hers for the briefest moment, his eyes offering an unspoken apology for his rough treatment. Then, that too was gone, evaporating in place of a rigid scowl. The scarred blonde performed a sudden about-face, striding to stand before the recruits. The instructor, seemingly so rigid and unyielding earlier, now made way for him readily. Naruto took a deep breath and released it in the same instant, his eyelids fluttering shut. When next they opened, his eyes were cold ships of sapphire. Listen well, maggots, he began. Before we begin your training here today, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Someone who can't sacrifice anything, can never change anything. Mikasa started in surprise. Where had that come from? But Naruto wasn't finished. Will you throw aside your humanity to confront these monsters? Or will you be trodden underfoot? Will you fight for your life? Will you be willing to toss aside that same life for the comrade standing beside you, for the sake of humankind? Will you throw yourself into battle to your deaths against overwhelming odds? Those who cannot do these things, leave here this instant. The military is no place for you. You'd be better off in the landfills. But for those of you say yes, for those of you who are willing to stay, know this: I will make you strong. Stronger than you've ever been. Strong enough to slay the Titans. Strong enough to protect humanity. The blonde let his words ring out amongst the cadets. Let them sink in as London as he dared. He was taking a risk here. A massive gamble that might not pay off. Some of you may recognize me, he continued, his voice dropping an octave. Some of you may have heard of me as well. 3 years ago I successfully aided in the evacuation of Wall Maria. But for those of you who do not know this face, and have not heard my name, allow me to reintroduce myself. I am Uzumaki Naruto, a shinobi, container of the nine-tailed fox, hero of humanity. A murmur of confusion and uncertainty rippled through the group. Mikasa alone remained unfazed by his flamboyant introduction, but not everyone had her stoic disposition, because someone beside her said something. Ano, could you repeat that, sir? You there? Naruto's neck rounded on the perpetrator with such speed that Mikasa thought his head would fly right off his shoulders. The girl on her right squeaked and performed an about-face, pigtails bouncing from the motion. She was a young thing. Mikasa realized, her dark eyes wide and fraught with uncertainty. They grew wider still when Naruto stalked towards them, eyes ablaze. He thrust his visage forward at her, forehead mere inches from her own. What's your name, cadet? He demanded. I'm Mina Carolina, sir. Mina, huh? Naruto mused. And why are you here today, Mina? To give my heart to humanity's cause, sir. And why would humanity want your heart, maggot? Because I choose to give it, sir. Well said. The blonde seemed to accept that response, drawing back from this dark-haired lass. It seems you have a strong spirit there. Good. I can use that. How would you like to become a shinobi, Mina? A sudden silence followed those words. Even Mikasa didn't understand his question. What the devil was a shinobi anyway? But despite her own confusion, she refused to let that uncertainty show. Mina, lacking such resolve, faltered almost immediately. I am afraid I don't understand the question, sir. What is a shinobi, sir? Instead of shouting as everyone had expected, the former Jonin's words were quite soft. Enough with the sir. Naruto waved her words aside. Just call me Naruto, or better yet, Naruto-sensei. A wistful look rested at the scowl he wore. Always wanted someone to call me that. But to answer what you've asked me, think of a shinobi as an elite warrior, such as myself, a soldier beyond soldiers, endowed with superhuman strength and speed, able to survive almost anywhere, do almost anything. I'm only willing to train a handful for now. His next words addressed the entire congregation. In other words, I will only train 6 of you in total. Those 6 will be forced to undergo hellish training in addition to your soldier training, for the next 3 years. It won't be easy, mind you. To become a shinobi takes great concentration and work ethic, not to mention chakra control. What is chakra, you ask? It is mental and physical energy, molded by years of training. Once produced, it can be used to create techniques known to most as jutsu. Here's an example, behold. Naruto crossed his fingers and a plume of smoke surrounded him, blinding all to his presence. When it cleared, he was surrounded by a phalanx of clones, living, breathing replicas of himself. A chorus of gasps rose up from the cadets at the unexpected sigh. What sorcery was this? Mikasa smiled in awe at the sight. She remembered seeing this before as a child. Odd, the idea of learning such a thing actually excited HR. This is the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto addressed the assembled candidates. It creates living, breathing clones of oneself that transmit memories of their experience once dispelled. A useful technique for scouting and sabotage. Additionally, Titans cannot tell the difference between you and a clone. Remember this if you don't want to get eaten. I could always show you my other jutsu, but this'll do for now. Murmurs of approval began to overtake the nervous whispers. Anyone could see the use for such a technique. With a Kage Bunshin, a shinobi could inherently avoid danger altogether, or call upon an ally to aid them in battle. A soldier could use it to distract a Titan, providing an opening for the killing blow. I'll say this again. Naruto barked out, my training, it is not for the weak-hearted. It will be harsh and demanding and you will have little to no time for rest. Some of you may consider it life-threatening. You may even die. However, if you somehow survive the next 3 years, I can promise you that you will be worth 10, no, 100 of the Solidiers you see manning our walls today. Now those who wish to accept, raise your hand and say hi as I pass you by, and if I deem you capable, I will train you. To everyone's amazement, Mina's hand immediately shot up before Naruto even turned around. Hi. Hi. The blonde drawled off, smiling. Hi, Naruto-sensei. Mina replied quickly, never lowering her hand for an instant. I wish to be trained. All right. Naruto bent before her and placed his palm flat upon her stomach. Let's see if you have any chakra coils for me to work with. Hold still and take deep, easy breaths. His hands seemed to pulse with an ethereal glow for a long moment as he spoke, eyes darting this way and that beneath his lids, searching. Mikasa watched intently, waiting to see what would happen. For a long moment, nothing did. Then, there, Mina doubled over, clutching at her stomach in the same instant that Naruto grunted in triumph. The girl's mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. Large eyes scritched themselves shut in a desperate attempt to block out the agony that had to be consuming her. Just when Mikasa thought Mina was certain to scream her lungs out, Naruto retracted his hand, eyes scrunching shut in unseen pain, and then it was done, leaving him standing and Mina holding her stomach. Congratulations, Naruto rewarded the exhausted girl with a slight nod. You've survived the worst of it. I've activated your chakra coils using my own power, so you'll be sore for a few hours. Nothing a bit of shut-eye and some aspirin won't fix. Now go back to the barracks and rest up. You've got a long 3 years ahead of you, you know? Thank you, sir. She gasped out, at Naruto's order. A soldier lead her away to her bunk, careful to keep the obviously winded lass from exhausting herself even further. Naruto watched his first disciple go with only the slightest shake of his head. Gonna have tall work on that enthusiasm. The deadpan was barely concealed. Anywho, moving on. Mikasa thought she caught a twinkle in the blonde's eyes as he crossed onto the next line to begin his inspection of the recruits. Perhaps it was just her imagination. Several raised their hands. Several were inspected. Nearly all of them were dismissed on the spot. And with each dismissal, Mikasa felt her chances dwindle. What was Naruto looking for? He seemed to be inspecting each cadet's stomach for some reason. Was that where these coils of theirs were supposed to be? Did Mina have something she didn't then? She could only wonder. A lifetime seemed to pass as Naruto painstakingly inspected each recruit, growing more and more disgusted with each and every failure. The sole exception to that was a boy named Jean Kirstein. He'd struck Mikasa as a laid-back sort, but his volunteering had shocked her. Hadn't he wanted to join the military police? He'd received a headbutt from their instructor for that laid-back attitude. What had inspired him to raise his hand then? Unlike the others, he did not fall, nor did he scream. He didn't even writhe in utter agony as the 5 failures before him had. he did curse, however. Fuck! The boy yelped as Naruto unsheathed his arm from his stomach, doubling over with a groan. You didn't say it would hurt this much. I didn't say it wouldn't hurt, now did I, maggot? No, but… Bam! Everyone flinched as the blonde ruthlessly headbutted him. Would you like another, boy? Naruto challenged as the loud-mouthed lad sank to his knees and clutched at his head. Jean was wise enough not to reply to that. Much to Naruto's amusement, he might have some potential after all. Despite the boy's obvious mouth and temper, he felt genuinely heartened for the first time in at least a year. Maybe there were more would-be shinobi hiding amidst these rejects, after all. With that thought in mind, he sent Jean off to rest with Mina for the duration of the afternoon, confident he'd have the 4 remaining shinobi he sought before nightfall. 4 more failures swiftly disabused him of that notion. For fuck's sake! Kurama growled, all these recruits, and only 2 of them have semi-decent chakra coils. And even then, you had to flood them with your chakra just to get them working. What the hell happened to this future? I hear ya, something must have gone wrong in this time. Jean and Mina might be great something or other descendants from shinobi. Probably why they had the coils in the first place. But the others nothing. Failures, all around, damn, just how far into the future had they been flung? Looks like you'll have more soldiers than I will shinobi, Shadi-san, Naruto remarked at the instructor. Don't get me wrong, you've got some fine material here, but these kids are meant to be soldiers, not shinobi by any means. Was it Mikasa's imagination or did Naruto's gaze seem to stray towards Reiner Braun as he said this? It must have been, because the stoic recruit didn't so much as bat an eyelash. Naruto grunted and once more resumed his exhaustive check of the recruits, who had volunteered, and then finally, he approached them. He stopped before Eren, despite the fact that Mikasa's brother hadn't raised his hand. He was quick to point that out too. No thank you, sir. Not interested, Eren? Naruto seemed slightly amused by the boy's obvious defiance. Sir, no sir. Jiger shook his head emphatically. I will be fine, sir. Such a shame, Naruto sighed. I can tell by looking at you. You have the right chakra coils. Alright then, have it your way. I guess that's about it for this line. Mikasa's hand shot up. Mikasa? Naruto and Eren finally had something in common. They both thought she was bat-hit crazy. Are you insane? Eren bit out. You saw what it did to the others. You might die. Mikasa ignored her brother. Naruto-san, I would like to take the training. She forced her voice to be level, despite the ever-growing pit of fear in her stomach. The man she had come to know as her savior and now her superior stared at her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and clenched the wrist of that hand in a vicious vice. One by one the fingers of that hand began to glow, seemingly pulsating with tongues of fire. Azure flames licking at the tips of each digits. Mikasa forced herself to swallow. Naruto had been quite clear in his instruction. This could kill the unprepared. I might die from this, she realized. I'm going to flood your circulatory system with most of my chakra, he explained. It's going to hurt a lot. This is your last chance to back out now, while you still can, huh? Why was he explaining this to her, and not the others? Did he actually care about what happened to her? The thought made her flush. You don't have to do this, he said one last time. Yes, she whispered softly, I do, because I want to be like you, she added silently. Then clench your teeth. Without warning he thrust his clawed fingers into her stomach and twisted the skin there, plunging his hand impossibly deep, hard. Oh my god, Kami! Mikasa's mouth snapped shut, her tongue screwing against the roof of her mouth as a wave of red-hot lava that came coursing through her veins. What pain! It felt as if every inch of her were afire. How had Mina been able to keep silent through this? More importantly, how would she? She didn't want to show any weakness, but it hurt. Kami! It hurt so much. Losing her mother was almost nothing compared to this. She could feel the energy Naruto had spoken of surging up inside of her, burgeoning within her, strengthening her, flooding her with warmth. She tried to focus on that strength, that warmth, desperate to ignore the everlasting agony so intent upon destroying her body from within, and God, she was going to die. Naruto yanked his arm back with a hiss of disgust, leaving her to slump forward, gasping for breath. Mikasa didn't understand. Her entire body was slicked with sweat and her throat was hoarse, confirming that she had indeed been screaming. No, this didn't make any sense. What had she done wrong? Why was she still in so much pain? Kit, I know, Naruto replied. Damn it, I can't believe she got your chakra instead of mine. We could have killed her. Look on the bright side. If she survives tonight, she'll come out stronger for it. Stronger than any shinobi you could have created. That's not the point, Bakuman. I'm trying to restart my race. Not kill innocent children. Give her 3 years, she won't be a child then, she'll make a fine mate by then. Urusai. Keep a handle on your chakra from now on. Hi, whatever you say. Unaware of the internal argument raging inside the blonde's skull, Mikasa clawed herself onto her hands and knees. Gradually, the feeling began to return to her arms and legs, leaving her awash in a sea of stiff, sore muscles and bruised bones. Had Naruto's chakra really damaged her this much? It didn't seem possible. Try not to move so much, Naruto warned. You've had a rough time of it. I'm fine, she insisted. Naruto's eyes widened a bit, but he did not contest her decision. Very well, he said shortly. Get some sleep when you can. I'll see you tonight. Without another word he turned his back on her and moved on down the line. Somehow, his silence stung more than anything. She watched him move on to the next volunteer and wondered why she had been the one to suffer under his chakra so much. All the while she pondered over it. Might I give it a try, sir? You sure about that, potato girl? It's gonna hurt. Naruto turned to regard Sasha over his shoulder, an almost predatory gleam in his eye. She'd fallen silent ever since he'd prevented her punished at the hands of shoddies. But now that she'd finally finished savoring her stolen snack, she appeared to have mustered up her courage. The only question was, would it last? There was only one way to find out. Sheathing his hand in chakra, he started forward, advancing at a relentless pace meant to frighten and intimidate. He had to be certain she wasn't a coward before he did anything. I'll endure it. Sasha gulped nervously. So be it. Naruto stepped forward and thrust his hand into her stomach. Itai. Sasha yelped and promptly fell over like, well, a sack of potatoes. Krista gasped. Is she? Nah, Naruto drawled, nudging her with the toe of his boot. She'll be just fine. I only gave her a short jolt as a precaution. Wait till nightfall. She'll be up and running with the rest of ya. Let's see then, that makes 4 of ya now. 3 girls and only 1 guy. Sheesh. She could see his narrow blue eyes sweeping over the recruits. The sudden lack of volunteers after Mikasa's near-death experiences, tch. I still have 2 more spots left, and no one left to fill them. Isn't anyone willing to try this? Are you all a bunch of cowards? Slowly, tentatively, Krista raised her hand. High. Beside her, Emer arched an eyebrow. Oh, are you serious? Krista didn't have time to reply to her comrade, because Naruto was suddenly there, towering over her, casting her body into shadow. Blazing blue eyes bored into her. The slight, quivering girl standing beneath him in defiance of his disbelief. His face was expressionless, giving no hint whatsoever as to the pride swelling in his chest. He didn't even bother to touch her as he'd done to others. Instead, his scouring gaze raked across her like hot coals before finally narrowing upon her stomach. Not bad, he admitted, patting her upon the head. You've got some nice coils. This shouldn't hurt too much. He pushed a single finger into her stomach. Krista felt a slight twinge and then it was done. Just like that, the last shinobi stepped back from her. Only now she could see the pride in his eyes. Get back to the barracks, cadet, he huffed gruffly. I've got high hopes for you. Naruto stepped past them without another word. Are you serious right now? Emer was hissing at Krista as he left them behind. That could have killed you. I feel fine. Like hell you do. Aw, looks like the tall one has feelings for the short one, Kurama cackled. This should be interesting. Indeed, Naruto made no mention of the strange scent coming from Emer. It was the same reason he hadn't bothered to inspect her for chakra coils. He had the succinct feeling she didn't have any. But putting that aside, he was already almost completely out potential recruits. That Armin lad might be promising, but he looked weak. Decisions. And you are? He asked, halting just before the last members of the recruits in line. Inexplicably, he was drawn to one in particular. Cold eyes gazed up at him beneath slightly coiffed flaxen hair, reflecting what most might have mistaken for boredom. She looked to be just around the same age as Mikasa and the others, but her eyes suggested she was in fact much older. Interesting. She was probably in her late teens already. What could possibly motivate her to become a soldier now? And then there was that faint scent lingering around her, just like Emer's. Your name? He repeated firmly. Annie Leonhardt, she replied at last. Not much enthusiasm there, Naruto noted. How are you going to face the Titans like that? I could ask you the same thing. Her words were soft, almost lacking in emotion, but even a fool could have sensed the challenge in them. All you've done so far is show us a few cheap parlor tricks and poke or punch all of us in the stomach. There was a silence, hanging over their heads like a guillotine, ready to drop. You insolent piece of dash! Shadi's face looked like it was about to burst open out from anger, but remarkably, Naruto didn't snap at Annie. But what he did next shocked everyone. Instead of exploding into anger as they expected him to, the blonde merely frowned and leaned forward, placing his hand on the back of Annie's head to steady her, hold her in place. Oh crap! Connie hissed, she's dead. But Annie was not dead, because the blonde didn't touch her after the fact. Naruto inhaled slowly, drinking deep of her scent, breathing in then out, once, twice, 3 times he did this, much to Annie's consternation. Then his eyes narrowed suddenly at her, sapphire orbs becoming more akin to winter ice than the brighty afternoon skies for which they were so well known. Cheap tricks, eh? His words were deadly soft now, meant only for himself and the girl whose head he was clutching in his hand. That's big talk coming from a Titan shifter. To her credit, Annie concealed her reaction well. Her body stiffened only slightly, but in the end, it was her eyes that gave her away. Those crystal blue orbs bulged so large she was almost certain they were going to fall right out of her head. He knew. She didn't know how, but somehow someway he knew that she could shift into a Titan. You, relax, Naruto soothed, placing his free hand upon Annie's shoulder, locking her in place. It's not like I plan on telling anyone. Besides, you haven't done anything wrong yet. Then again, he mused, his grip growing tighter upon her scalp, if you're planning on starting something, I could always just crush your pretty little head right here, right now. No one would question my actions. Hell, if anything, I'd save myself a world of worry about your motives, plans, whatever it is you seem to be up to. Should I do that, I wonder? Kill you now and spare myself the trouble, or take you under my wing and see how you turn out? Mikasa couldn't help but wonder, what were the two of them talking about? Whatever it was, Naruto's words seemed to have taken a toll on his fellow blonde. She was an absolute mess. Annie couldn't bring herself to think or to focus. She could barely even breathe. Her mind was racing, scrabbling for thought, clamoring for a conclusion. The jig was up, he knew. She didn't know how, but somehow, this guy knew. And what was this about him being a Titan shifter? Was he bluffing? Maybe, but that didn't matter, not now. She couldn't decide whether to shift into her Titan form and flee or simply stay put and play dumb, hoping to bluff her way out of this situation. No, it was too risky. This Naruto character was too shrewd. If she tried to lie her way out of this, she'd likely lose her life. Even now, she was all too aware of those fingers digging into her skull. If she tried anything, he'd crush her head without so much as a second thought. Indeed, could probably kill her on a whim. That he hadn't done so yet, that she still drew breath, was for reasons unknown. Just what did he want with her? More importantly, how much did he know? Did he know about Shadi-san? Naruto spoke up suddenly, causing Annie to flinch, jarring her train of thought from its tracks. I'll be borrowing this one for a bit. Keep the recruits here until I get back. Before either student, or even the instructor, could hope to protest, the shinobi took his hand from Annie's shoulder and did something with his fingers. She didn't get a very good look at what he was doing, but whatever it was caused the ground to lurch beneath her feet, everything began to blur, leaving her eyes darting frantically back and forth in her head. Then, blackness. Annie woke to find herself bound and gagged. Warm sunlight filtered down onto her face, a single shaft of brilliance stabbing into her left eye. With a start, she remembered what had happened. That blonde bastard. She lurched upright with a start, gasping against the rag in her mouth, wincing as cold iron bit into her wrist. It was then that she realized her arms were shackled behind her back. Damn it, she couldn't shift if she was unable to inflict some sort of wound upon herself to begin with. Naruto must have known this and planned accordingly. Speaking of which, where the devil was he? Well, that was quick. A cold shiver shot down the blonde's spine. Just now, she could have sworn she felt killer intent. I'm surprised, Naruto called out yet again, his voice echoing somewhere out of sight. You were only out for about 15 minutes there. Titan shifters really are scary. Annie muttered a curse through the gag. She stood with wooden legs, not taking enough care for herself or her body, sparing only a precursory glance for her surroundings. What she saw caused her heart to plummet into her stomach. Trees stretched around her for miles on end, blotting out the afternoon sun, presenting no easy means of escape. Escape, ha! Even had she known how to utilize the 3D maneuver gear and she wouldn't have known which way to go, and if she tried to flee as she was, she'd probably be picked off before she even made it out of the forest. Have you calmed down now? Annie swung around, gasping as Naruto emerged from the bark of a nearby tree. He simply stepped out of it as though he'd always been there, the wood rippling before his passing. What the hell was he? In the time it took for her to wonder it aloud, he was already standing before her. Welcome to the forest of giant trees, the blonde replied by way of greeting, indicating their surroundings with a broad sweep of his arm. I've got my Hiratian seals plastered all over this forest, and since they never fade it's sorta become my own personal killing ground. Killing ground? Oh no, oh no no no! No, he brought her out here to be butchered then. That was why she was bound. So she couldn't escape. Yet again, the overwhelming sensation of fear crashed down on Annie, rooting her where she stood. The slightest of smiles plucked at his lips. Could he sense her fear? Which reminds me, I wouldn't go down there if I were you. He pointed towards the forest floor and a small flame ignited upon his fingertip, its light revealing a mass of writhing shapes just below their feet. Despite herself, Annie blanched. Here in the light of Naruto's candle, she could see shapes, grotesque, monstrous shapes, trying to climb up and eat them. Titans. There had to be hundreds of them. Despite the knowledge that they were safe up here for the time being, she shivered at the sight of them. For some reason, I'm catnip to these guys, Naruto explained. They're always trying to devour me. Maybe it has something to do with my chakra. Annie refused to dignify that with a response. Silent treatment, eh? He laughed at her defiance. Fine then, you just sit there. I'll do the talking. You remind me of himself when I was younger, Naruto continued, confiding in her with a glance. Back then I was all alone, too, although I wasn't exactly as cold as you. He whistled at her glare. Ooh, scary. There's no need to make such a face. I just want to talk, that's all. He patted the bough beside him, indicating that he wanted her to sit. Reluctantly, Annie complied, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Stubbornly she sat as far as she possibly could from him, refusing to look her captor in the eye. If he expected to get information for her, he had another thing coming. Would you feel better if I let you transform? Her fellow blonde offered. If I made you fight me? Would you think about using your powers for the good of mankind then? Annie's head snapped towards Naruto's like a puppet severed from its strings. What on earth was he saying? Use her powers for the good of mankind? When she had a mission to complete? Well? He prodded her verbally. Is that a yes or no? Her only reply was a grunt. Did he really expect her to answer with this gag on? If I remove that, will you try to escape? She shook her head slowly. Of course she'd try to escape. But not just yet. Here, he reached around her head and untied the rag cloth. Don't make me chop off your arms while I'm at it. Clever bastard. She daren't transform without her arms. He'd have her pinned in an instant, biting back a vitriolic retort. The blonde silently resolved herself to wait for her best opportunity. Now that he'd ungagged her, she had a chance to pry him for information. That information might aid her in her mission, and what better way to probe him for information than to attack his weakest area? The one thing she, as a fellow shifter, knew that he hated beyond anything else? You're a shifter as well, she said, like me. Of course, Naruto tilted his head in continuance. I may hate shifting, but I find it helps my self-control if I have a clear goal in mind. For example, my goal today would be to stopping you from throwing your life away fruitlessly. Because that's exactly what you'll be doing if I let you go down there right now, and he hated to admit it. But he had a point there. Even if she ran away from here at top speed, she'd eventually tire. And once she did, they'd be on her almost immediately, but she wasn't about to admit that to him. You're so kind. The venom in her voice could have peeled rust off steel. Is that what you think I am? Annie blinked and he was gone. Then something or someone grabbed her by the face, knocking her body sideways into the bough. Stars spangled before her vision as that someone held her off the branch and dangled her down, leaving her hanging over the blackness. I am not kind, Naruto hissed into her ear, his voice blacker than any pit, bleaker than even the scene below them. I'm not even all that nice. I've seen things you can't possibly imagine. Done things that would make your blood curdle in your veins. My body count is higher than the walls themselves. What's one more body on that conscience? Huh? The reason I'm cutting you some slack here, the only reason, is because I know what it feels like to happen to be all alone. to do something you'd rather not. Don't make me regret that decision, girl. I could drop you right now and not lose a wink of sleep over it, in fact. Abruptly, he released her head. Annie barely had time to blink before she dropped towards the forest floor, towards the awaiting titans. Despite knowing she could transform, her mind was inexplicably frozen, filled with fear at the sight of those gaping maws filled with row upon row of slavering teeth. Oto! Naruto reached down and calmly grabbed her by the nape of the neck just before she could fall into range of the arms. Can't have you dying on me just yet. Exhaling in a long suffering sigh, he hauled her back onto the branch and tossed her over his shoulder. Annie landed with a pained grunt, her ass bouncing off the branch, her chest hitching in a soft gasp as she realized she was still alive. You insufferable bastard! She sobbed. What if you hadn't caught me in time? Naruto laughed at her. Then I would have transformed and come to your rescue. But you know I think I've taken a liking to ya, he drawled aloud, his ever-present grin widening marginally as she glanced in his direction. That settles it. I've decided, Annie Leonhardt, you'll be my disciple. With a grin that looked more devilish than anything she'd seen in her life, Naruto reached down for her, his hand muffled her hair, surprising in his affections. This was her chance to escape. His guard was down. If she transformed now and attacked him, if she ran at full speed, she might just stand a chance of making it out of here alive. Wait, he was probably expecting that. She'd witnessed his speed firsthand. She'd be a fool to go against such power without preparing herself accordingly. No, she would wait for her chance to strike at him, to strike at this insufferably cruel, unbelievably handsome bastard Ark. I have to stop thinking like that. If looks could kill. Naruto seemed to consider her for a moment, again with that scary look. Just for that, I think I'll show you something special. He made a motion with his left hand and a clone materialized behind Annie in a plume of smoke. Within an instant it had her, seizing her arms and wrists her before she could think to escape. Hold still, it sighed, taking hold of her other shoulder. This'll only take a minute. She was forced to look on, helpless, as Naruto summoned still more clones and sent them down into the mass of writhing titans miles below their feet. Each doppelganger clutched a massive sphere of swirling wind in their hand, the design almost vaguely reminiscent of a giant shuriken. Before Annie could wonder at its purpose or its intent, a massive explosion greeted her ears. Body parts flew in every direction as the raisin shurikens detonated. He killed them all, hundreds of them, in only an instant. There we go. Naruto stared down at the smoldering crater he'd left behind, pleased by his handiwork. I do so love it when a plan comes together. Now I'll have a chance to show you it in relative peace. Even as he said this, the clone tightened its grip on her shoulders. Just before the original launched himself off the bough, the clone leapt after him, dragging Annie with it. Almost immediately thereafter they were falling, the three of them plummeting down into the darkness towards the forest floor at a breakneck pace, leaving Annie's eyes to water as they streaked through the black. She knew what he was going to show her, or at least she had an idea of what it might be, and it terrified her. Here we are. The shinobi clapped his hands twice as they alighted upon the forest floor, igniting a small light over their heads, another of his jutsu no doubt. Watch closely now, Naruto cautioned, raising a hand to his mouth. You'll only see this for a second. With that, he bit down hard. What? The land burst as a lightning bolt descended from the heavens, shearing through the trees to strike him, shearing through the forest, sending her vision topsy-turvy. Steam erupted between the two of them, threatening to scald her from head to toe. When something strode out from that cloud of steaming smoke, she felt her lungs drop into the pit of her stomach, and she was literally unable to catch her breath. Naruto peered down and grinned at her, exposing row upon row of deadly teeth in this massive new form. Annie began to quiver at the sight of it. This titan, it could barely even be called such. But that's not possible. Hours later, Mikasa glanced up sharply as a swirl of leaves announced Naruto and Annie's return, their unannounced arrival nearly causing her to fall from the wires that kept her suspended. It was a crucial part of their maneuver gear training, and she was determined to master it. Others lost their concentration at the blonde's unannounced arrival. Flopping face first into the unyielding earth at their feet, Mikasa alone managed to preserve her bodily balance. Just barely. Annie looked visibly shaken, as though her mind had been through a blender and back. She was trembling, eyes slightly wide, her knees all but knocking together. Mikasa had no way of knowing that this blonde alone had bore witness to Naruto's titan form. She didn't even know her savior had such a form. Annie did. She'd thought herself ready for it, but the mere sight of that thing had left her absolutely terrified, not that she'd ever admit it. But to know something that large could move so fast and strike with that much power, it brought a frightening level of realism to her mission. If she ever tried to accomplish her task, Naruto would double-toothlessly stand in her way, and he would kill her. She knew that now. Were she ever to try and face him in her Titan form, she'd have to be well prepared, because if she wasn't, she would die, just as all those Titans had died. Did I frighten you? Naruto was saying as they drew within earshot, causing Mikasa to cock her head aside. You mentioned you could shift into something else, his fellow blonde grumbled back. When Naruto jerked backwards and laughed, no one expected him to do so. It was a deep, throaty sound that garnered everyone's attention and left them simultaneous shivering. Despite that, the blonde had never felt better. Now was as good a time as any to get that elephant out of the room, and it would also serve to help keep Annie in line for the time being at least. Shall we? We shall. Why, I'm so glad you asked, Annie. A slow, sinister smile spread across the whiskered visage of her fellow blonde. Allow me to show you. Suddenly and without warning, Naruto leapt long and high. His sudden lurch launched him into the air, leaving him hanging overhead. For what felt like an eternity he simply hovered there over their heads. Then, with a roar that could put the colossal Titan to shame, he sank both incisors deep into his right hand. This time, he didn't bother to hold back. Kurama's chakra surged through him like a tidal wave, swirling around him in an opaque sphere of sapphire and scarlet. His body was changing, morphing, even as gravity began to assert its hold. By the time his paws hit the ground, his body no longer that of a mere man, but of a magnificent golden fox. It towered over them with a snarl, its feet gripping the outer edge of the courtyard, 9 tails lashing at the air like a series of whips. Someone screamed, but a harsh hiss from Naruto from the monster he had become swiftly silenced it. There you have it, the fox growled down at them. Is that answer enough for you, cadet? Numbed, Annie nodded. She hadn't been expecting this. It had all happened so swiftly. Naruto had transformed into the kitsune in the blink of an eye. Mikasa gawped up at it, realized just how much larger the beast was compared to the fierce creature she'd seen 3 years ago. To this day, she felt a snake of dread coil into her stomach. Peering up at it was almost too much to bear. The damn thing was larger than a mountain. Had he been holding back all those years ago? Surely he must have, because there was no explanation for the immense discrepancy in his size from then to now. There you go. Naruto's deep rumble vanished in mid-sentence, his great fox form dissolving into the afternoon sky in a pillar of light. I think that's enough of a demonstrations for one day. Now, dismissed. Return to your activities. Fine. Naruto watched her go and warred with himself, fighting a smile. He was taking a gamble with Annie, not just with his life, but that of humanity. He knew this. Common sense demanded that he eradicate her here and now, before she became a threat. And yet he just couldn't bring himself to do that. He'd been bluffing back there when he'd said he would drop her. To kill an innocent 16-year-old girl, even if it meant protecting humanity, he simply didn't have it in him. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer, not anymore. You're overthinking things, Kurama interjected. Let's just wait 3 years and see what happens. You think I can get her to join our side? She'd make one hell of an ally. Kit, if it's you we're talking about here, you could probably get her to scale the wall with her bare hands. Thanks for the vote of confidence. No problem, the kitsune retorted. After all, in 3 years, these girls will be fair game for us. OW. What did you hit me for? For being a fool, says the fool himself. Naruto's lips quirked in a slight smile at that. Kurama had a point there. He wasn't God, or the devil, or even a monster. It wasn't for him to decide these things. Not for him to determine the fate of these cadets, what they said, what they did, what paths they might take once leaving the military. It was all theirs to decide. He could only hope to prepare them as best he could, can come what may. Yes, that's right, he thought to himself. After all, I'm only human. Nay, Naruto-kun? Hi, Hand-san? Would you transform for me? For the last time? No! He snapped at the brunette that was by all rights, technically his superior. I've had enough poke and prodding for one day. Thank you very much. Now let me be. Just once. She continued, all but begging. It's not fair that Levi and Erwin got to see it before me. Yada, can we please go on ahead now? Kurama begged, his deep voice lanced with a rare touch of fear. I'm not enjoying this. Seriously, don't you dare leave me alone with her. Sorry boy, you're on your own. Uzumaki Naruto groaned and tried to bury his head further into the folds of his scouting cloak, tried to ignore that familiar voice ringing in his ears. There was only so much fabric, however, and with his height and build he couldn't manage anywhere near as well as he would have liked. Instead, he merely urged his horse on ahead, spurring the animal away from the group. That was the problem with the Scouting Legion, he reflected. The problem of being a part of something again. This wasn't like teaching and training his disciples, though he'd rather enjoyed spending those 3 years on Mikasa and the others where he could dictate the pace. Here, surrounded by these men and women of equal skill and Titan-killing prowess, the Jinchuriki had to curtail his frustrations, many though they were, and work with them as a team. That was how humanity had survived for the last century, and it was how they intend to continue surviving now, by working together, functioning as one. These seemingly ordinary folks had slain more than a dozen Titans. It was one of the reasons Naruto had first thought to join them in the first place. His skills were better served outside the walls, where he didn't risk hurting or killing his comrades by using his full strength. Besides, it was far more exciting out here. Or so he'd thought. That was before they forced him to learn how to use this blasted maneuver gear. Before they forced him to ride a horse instead of letting him run on his own 2 feet as a true shinobi should. Owen had assured him the indignation would fade in time, and to the rest of the men, it would make it seem that he was willing to make compromises. Unfortunately, Naruto had never much been one for those. His pride burned for every instant that he was forced to ride this horse, a stubborn mare that simply refused to move at the speed its master wished. It irked him to no end that he couldn't just run on ahead of them on foot and slaughter the enemy. That he was forced to ride an animal, a beast of burden no less regulated to move at their pace when every fiber of his being screamed for action and activity, irked him, to say the least, as did the fact that he could no longer wander outside the walls at his own discretion. But time and time again he had to remind himself that he needed to conserve his stamina, mighty and everlasting though it might be, and at least keep up the appearances that he was human. His transformation 3 years ago had given the denizens of Wall Rose quite the shock. He had heard that there'd even been some deaths. Quite a few heart attacks had been reported that day. Come on, don't be like that. Not again. Naruto nearly slammed his head into the back of his horse as Hanji rose up beside him, her steed easily matching his stride for stride. Hanji Zoe, a veteran of the Survey Coppers and admittedly quite the looker when you got past her fascination for all things Titan and authorize. No one knew had laid eyes upon his Titan transformation save Erwin and Levi, but unfortunately for them Hanji had been quite dogged in her persistence. When confronted with the knowledge that humanity's sole Titan shifter shows how much they knew, was riding right beside her, the woman simply hadn't been able to help herself. Why, Kami? Why oh why, was it his fate to be surrounded by weirdos? I'm begging you here, she pleaded, pretty please. Hanji, I will eat you. Oh, scary. A sly grin crept across her visage. Is that a promise? I'm not kidding, Bakayuru. It's no use trying to dissuade her, Levi chided beside him. She has every right to be excited about this, just as I do. You're excited? Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Well, he certainly didn't look it. In fact, if one were to glance at Levi, they wouldn't have thought much of him at all. Short, with straight black hair, sharp eyes and an almost perpetually disinterested expression caused him to look as though he wasn't interested in anything or downright apathetic. Despite the contrary, he almost reminded Naruto of a mini Sasuke, though he'd never have said that aloud. Still, just the thought of it made him smile. The shorter man met Naruto's smile with a deadpan of his own. Oh, what are you smirking for? Nothing. No reason. There was a prolonged silence as the three of them rode alongside one another, the countryside blurring by. So, Hanji. Eep. Laughter arose from the rest of the riders, and for a moment the blonde couldn't help but wonder, was all this an act on her part? Was Hanji deliberately messing with him just so he'd show some emotion, to get them to lower their defenses and welcome him as one of their own? Hanji's enthusiasm is commendable, Owen reminded, his voice carrying on from the head of their formations. Levi and myself aside, we've yet to see what you're capable of firsthand. This is, after all, your first official outing with the Legion. Whereas Levi's appearance contrasted his demeanor, their commander was the exact opposite, stoic and stern with short-cropped blonde hair and gray eyes. He radiated a no-nonsense aura, one of command and cold logic. Your skills and battle prowess might be the tipping point we need in regaining Wall Maria. If Levi vouches for your skills, then I trust you implicitly. Damn. Naruto and Kurama shared the same thought. The shinobi's grin was positively beatific. He'd known the commander was blunt, but damn. Way to flatter him. Well, when you put it that way, don't be too surprised. If I wipe out all the Titans by myself, he grinned. For all his earlier woes, it felt good to be a part of something again. Then Hanji started pestering him about the transformation again, and his glee faded. He was so busy smacking her over the head he didn't even notice it when Levi rode ahead of him to join Erwin. Indeed, he never gave the matter a second thought. Are you sure it's alright to pump him up like that? It helps if he's motivated, Erwin replied, never once glancing back at the whiskered warrior. Today's exercise will cement everyone's faith in him. If all goes well, we should be able to successfully retake Wall Maria in a month from now. What's important now at this moment is camaraderie. The others won't be willing to throw their lives away for someone they don't trust. Besides, it's better to have him out here in the field than back in the walls surrounded by those cultists. Levi bit back a grimace at that remark. Because as always, Erwin had spoken nothing but the truth. The wall cult hated Naruto with a passion. To them he was an affront to their 3 holy walls. A devilish demon who would bring only disaster and despair. They didn't care if he claimed to be on their side or not. They just wanted him dead. His unexpected kitsune transformation hadn't made him any friends 3 years ago, and were his Titan form to ever come to light in the public eye, he'd probably be even worse off than before. And then there was the matter of the military police. Sheesh. The more he thought about it, the more Levi realized just how many enemies Naruto had made for himself. What was to stop him from becoming fed up with everything and leaving it all behind? Those so-called he kept on about. His shinobi? The ones he'd spent the last 3 years training? Norwin was right. They couldn't afford to lose him. Humanity couldn't afford to lose him. You're a manipulative bastard, you know that? He shook his head at last, risking a glance back at Naruto. Although I can't say I disagree with you. Titans! When the cry went up from Petra a split second before the forest erupted to the south, spilling out a swarm of the beasts, pounding in their direction. For a moment, just a moment, the entire Survey Corps froze. There were so many. Too many. Dozens. Maybe even more. Erwin knew at once what the men and women of his legion were thinking. Where the devil had they been hiding all this time? But now was not the time to hesitate in the face of this newfound adversity. Now was the time for action. Make for the trees, Erwin commanded, knowing at once that even with their 3D maneuver gear the group stood little to no chance on flat terrain. Naruto didn't listen. Even as he thought to issue the same command to the blonde, he was already standing atop his horse, a savage grin ripping across his whiskered face. He made no move to make use of his maneuver gear not even when more than half the horde broke off from their pursuit of Levi's group and raced towards him. Something was swirling there in the palm of his hand, something that looked remarkably like a large throwing star of sorts, with that same smile still fixed firmly in place. The blonde cocked his arm back as though he'd been preparing to throw it all along. Erwin, Levi, and the rest of the recon corps had just enough time to realize what the blonde intended before he flung it forward. It split the air in twine as it rocketed forward, taking the heads of several titans before imploding and incapacitating dozens more. Naruto leapt after it on foot, surging forward with a speed Erwin was hard-pressed to believe. So this was why he'd wanted to run. He was far faster than their horses. But why was he charging directly at the titans? He must have had some plan, else he wouldn't have. All units, halt! Erwin ordered, realizing exactly what the blonde intended. What he was about to unleash. Even from here, he could see Naruto thrusting a thumb within his mouth. Within seconds, he'd doubtlessly bite on that digit, and when he did, here it comes! Hanji's squeal overrode his thoughts. An errant glance confirmed the woman was wide-eyed and grinning, practically drooling at the thought of what was to come, the transformation. Seconds later, the clearing erupted in a thunderbolt. Bolts of golden and crimson light lanced through the clearing in a blinding brilliance that left everyone reeling, flinging their arms before their faces to ward against it. This sudden explosion of otherworldly power. All that remained of Naruto was a smoking crater, obscured by a burning haze of steam. There he goes again, Levi murmured, spurring his steed to a halt beside Erwin's. Did he have to transform already? Would you rather he turn into that giant fox and risk crushing us all underfoot? Erwin arched an eyebrow. TCH, his second-in-command scoffed, but said no more. It was true that his kitsune form was far more efficient, but if they went anywhere near the conflict then they risked being trod to pieces. For a moment, nothing happened, nothing stirred in that pit of sizzling steam, nothing moved. Hanji leaned forward eagerly against her saddle, her gaze greedily devouring the distance between her and the crater and the monstrosity that was bound to emerge from within. She could barely contain her anticipation. The moment Naruto would emerge, would it be a 7-meter titan? Maybe a 15-meter? Would it resemble Naruto at all? Or would it deform even his most masculine features? Oh, she couldn't wait. When was he going to? Ruahua warg. As if to defy her every expectations, a massive titan towering 20 meters tall, easily the size of a large building, came bounding out of the smoke, roaring its head off, its legs lopped forward in long, earth-consuming strides, carrying it towards its downed fellows at an almost ruthless pace. Hanji's jaw nearly fell clear off her face. Esu, here she goes again, Gunther groaned, bracing himself for the outburst that was slowly building inside their Buntaichu. Suga! Her scream threatened to overpower their ears, nearly deafening the entire squad on the spot. Look at him. He's huge. Massive. Big, indeed. Although he'd seen this behemoth once before, Owen's eyes still bucked at the sight of it. Its body was entirely unlike any titan he'd ever seen, and he had seen many in his time. Vaguely humanoid it was, in that it stood up on 2 legs. That was where the resemblance ended. Instead of the standard type, this monstrosity bore not 2, not 4, but 6 arms, 3 to each side. Shaggy blonde hair obscured blazing red orbs and a whiskered face, dropping past his ears and shoulders, framing a mouth full of knife-like teeth that would make even the most hardened soldier shiver. It's gigantic, Petra whispered, awed by the sheer size of the creature bounding away from them, its armored arms swinging a mile a minute. Naruto's titan form put on a sudden burst of speed, cannonading forward into its fellow titans with a roar, fists swinging. Caught unawares, they never stood a chance. 6 arms lashed onto arm and limb and all manner of bodily parts, tearing them free in great gouts of gore. All those hands did was destroy, grabbing and tearing and pulling and wrenching with terrible speed and precision. It was as if they had become blades, 6 separate swords that sliced and slashed and severed whatever they touched. Naruto felt them crunch beneath those mighty fists like beetles popping under a boot. Their bodies broke like shells and the softness within was ground to gory smears on the ground below, and, throughout it all, not a single drop of blood spattered upon him. Any moisture that dared near this gleaming demon of death simply evaporated on the spot. He was death incarnate, come to wreak havoc and destruction, come to destroy the fools that dared stand against him, come to deliver his own brutal brand of justice. Even the largest of titans didn't stand a chance against him. He simply overpowered them. The steam poured from his every orifice. It sang power and hatred and strength. This is death. This is retribution, and I love it. Don't lose yourself, Kurama cautioned. Relax, Naruto replied as he effortlessly crushed a titan's skull with one hand and bit the head of another. I've had all of 3 years to master this form. It's like a second skin to me now, although I still prefer our Biju form. Still, there was a certain exhilaration to be found. Fighting in this body, 3 years ago, he'd loathed it. He couldn't use any of his ninjutsu or senjutsu in this form and was limited to use his armored arms and strength to eradicating the enemy. His anger had come from his inexperience in this form, but with experience had come strength, and with strength, confidence. Now, when he fought in this great form, he simply felt free. He wondered if Annie felt the same. He'd never seen her in her titan form before, so he had no way of knowing what she looked like when she did change. On your right. Naruto dropped down to his haunches just before a 16-meter type sailed over his head, its spindly arms still outstretched in a failed attempt to grab him. An errant thought caused the extra arms mounted atop his shoulders to twist around backwards, rising to greet this new threat. They grabbed hold of either end of the titan and pulled, tearing it asunder like so much tissue paper. The severed halves dropped to the earth amidst the swarming titan's upper half twitching, still struggling to rise as the blonde's foot descended upon their neck. One stomp later and the titan's corpse joined the others in a swiftly growing pile at his feet. He lost himself in battle after that, his body moving purely on instinct, crushing anything that came near. His mind no longer processing the time or techniques it took to end the titans in artful fashion. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't enjoying this. It was the closest thing he felt to a physical high. Every fiber of his being rejoiced in the ugly slaughter taking place around him, glorying in the carnage that he'd created. Alas, all good things have to end. It took him less than 3 minutes to kill 25 titans. Funny, it seemed like so much longer. As he crushed the nape of his final opponent, he glanced around and realized the clearing was finally devoid of those disgusting aberrants that had come from out of nowhere. Such a shame. Nothing save a swarm of titan numbering in the hundreds had any chance of stopping him in this form. He had just enough time to catch back his breath, then he loped towards them in slow strides, eerily aware that just about everyone save Erwin and Levi had their hand on a sword. Well, that was to be expected. Calm down, Levi cautioned everyone, he's not going to attack. But sir, just calm down, their squad leader repeated. Naruto's titan form gazed at them for what felt like a small eternity. Then he sat down, sending the earth shuddering beneath him. The motion was so sudden and unexpected that all but most experienced members of the Scouting Legion drew backwards. Even Hanji flinched aside at the sudden motion, her eyes slightly wide as the titan simply sat there, contemplating them. Its jaws and mouth appeared to be moving, creaking open and shut as it struggled to form the words and spoke. Yo! Naruto's voice, an octave lower than normal, issued forth from the titan's mouth. Pretty sure that makes my kill count 25 now. Silence reigned supreme. Across the plains, of the entire Scouting Legion, none save Erwin and Levi could believe their eyes. This was a trick, right? Surely their eyes had to be playing tricks on them. They had to be. It didn't make sense otherwise. There was just no way that this titan, this demon of death and destruction, once so fiercely and furious, could possibly be so calm. And yet he was. Naruto sat there like the Buddha himself, smiling back at them, his crimson eyes placid and cool, with not so much as a hint of rage. He can really control it, Petra murmured, awed by the display. Oro said in disbelief, you gotta be shitting me. Erd simply shook his head. This is the power he possesses. Erwin felt a supreme sense of satisfaction as he folded both arms before his chest. Naruto had single-handedly done in his titan form what would have taken even Squad Levi at least a few minutes to do. Decimated more than 24 titans on his own, without any assistance, and now he was speaking to them through his titan form, displaying almost flawless control. This was it, right here. This was the key to taking back their lives and land, sitting there on the grass before them. With the powers this man possessed, and those that he'd been training, they might just stand a chance. Those members of the Recon Corps who remained gathered were likewise experiencing different states of disbelief. Hanji shared none of that disbelief. Naruto! Everyone jumped. Can I touch one of those arms? She begged. It's okay, right? Right. Just let me touch it, eh? Naruto looked to Erwin for confirmation. The latter merely shrugged. What the hell? Go ahead, Yada! No sooner had the words left her lips than the squad captain bounded forward, wrapping both hands around a single finger. They're big, she observed, noting the calluses upon that lone digit. Really big. Unbelievably big. Nay, how does it feel to be inside that titan's body? Does it feel hot? Are you burning up right now? I really want to know. This bitch is crazy. Kurama hissed inside Naruto's mind. Remind me never to come out when she's around. Is the mighty Kurama afraid of a single human? Yes. Very much so. Naruto laughed at that and his titan form laughed with him. Nah, he chortled softly, flexing his fingers. It doesn't burn. Feels kinda cold, actually. Can you pick me up? Naruto's facepalm sent the earth shaking. Are you fucking crazy? You'd better do it. Levi sighed. She'll never stop pestering you otherwise. The things I do for women. Slowly, gingerly, Naruto opened one of his many hands and waited for the squad leader to crawl into it. Then, when he was certain that she was secure, he slowly began to raise his palm, even to his large ears. Hanji's squeal was practically deafening. Aha! Her goggled gaze darted this way and that, hazel eyes eagerly observing every inch of his whiskered visage. You're even more impressive up close. I could just kiss you, squad leader. That's dangerous. One of their men cried. He might eat you. Don't tempt me, Naruto growled softly, but his words lacked rancor. Oh, I would never. Hanji practically purred, reaching up to rub at his giant cheek. You might act gruff all the time, but you're really a big softed. Gay. She didn't know it, but she'd hit the nail on the head there. He really wasn't trying to distance himself from others. Naruto really didn't. He simply didn't want to risk harming anyone with these incredible powers of his. There was a reason for all these weights and limiters he made himself wear now. Without them, he ran the risk of truly hurting someone with something so casual as a slap on the back. You've seriously got a thing for titans, don'tcha? He drawled back. Yup. Hanji's smile practically outshone the sun. Deep within the titan, Naruto actually flushed. Alright, playtime's over. Somebody wanna get me out of here before Miss Mad Scientist tries to dissect me or something? He grunted in baritone, one of his 6 arms rising to indicate the plated fold in his neck, the remaining 5 twitching slightly from the odd motion. I'd try it on my own, but it's a bitch and takes 5 minutes to do by myself. I'll help. Petra volunteered before Hanji could, snaring his shoulder with a wire and whisking herself up to meet him. She felt she owed him that much for doubting the boy's skill. Be careful, Petra, Oro warned as she neared the blonde's hulking form. We don't know if he's serious or not. Police, came Naruto's booming reply, as if I'd hurt a lady. Petra sincerely hoped that was true, that this wasn't all just some act to get them to lower their guards so he could slaughter them. It would be child's play for him to reach up and crush her right now. Out here, in open air, with nothing to hook her maneuver gear into, she was easy prey. Gingerly she clambered onto the rock-hard muscle of his shoulder, steadying herself with both arms. His titan form really was absolutely massive this close. She felt like a speck of dust compared to him. I'm in the neck, he grunted as she ascended. Careful not to break your blades, there's some armor up here. Some armor was an understatement. The back of his neck was protected by thick plating. Nothing short of a titan's tooth could hope to shatter it directly. No wonder Naruto couldn't emerge on his own. But if one were to place their blade into the grooves between the flesh and bone, unthinking, Petra sank her blade into the flesh of his neck and began to pry at it, only to be stopped seconds later by a furious hiss. Fuck! A pained growl came from beneath the wall of thick flesh. That was my arm. Sorry. Just be glad I can regenerate. I've almost got it, Petra replied, splitting the groove with her blade, forcing it upwards with all of her strength, and, I'm out. Naruto burst out of the back of the neck in a burst of gore, his body still steaming from the motion. Finally, I was starting to suffocate in there. Unfortunately, he'd made one miscalculation, so had Petra. She hadn't expected him to emerge that swiftly once she'd cut him free, and he hadn't expected her to still be standing there. The result? Collision. They fell from the titan's shoulder in a tangle of arms and legs, much to the amusement and disbelief of the Survey Corps, crashing to the ground in pained heap. Well, this isn't awkward at all, Naruto observed as she lay atop him. We barely know each other, Petra. Petra jerked back as if she'd been burned. Nay, her face was flushing 6 different shades of scarlet. WWW, what are you saying, Naruto-dano? You're the impressionable sort, it seems. Kaya! Everyone laughed at her reaction. Not to slap the blonde silly, but to leap off him and bolt in the opposite direction, even from. That was way too fast. Hanji complained, squire-arming about as the titan's body began to dissolve, its owner picking himself up off the floor and walking away. I wanted to do some more tests. Use the bones or something. Naruto snapped back, I don't care what you. That was when he felt it, a light tingle, as though a thought somewhere in the back of his mind were pulling at him, tugging for his attention. Naruto slowed. Taking his thumb out of his mouth, he turned, facing back in the direction from whence they'd first come, features pinched in concentration as he tried to sense what it was that had called to him. It was a Horatian kunai. He managed to craft nearly 24 of them during his short-lived time here, 7 of which he'd given away, 1 for each of his disciples. Those 7 were his finest made. He could use them to traverse miles in an instant. All he had to do was open the link in his mind in an eye blink, and he'd be transported to that kunai's rough location. But why was he being called now? He'd given them explicit instructions not to call upon him unless they were in dire straits or if the walls were ever breached. Oh, son of a bitch! Naruto must have cursed aloud because in the next instant everyone was looking at him. What's wrong, Naruto? Erwin readied the anxiety on his face like a book. The walls. He had just enough time to warn, and in a crackle of golden light he was gone. Meanwhile, in Walrose, death had finally come for Mina Carolina. This was it then. She was going to die. She could smell the warm, fetid breath of the Titan, feel it on her face, swarming around her as she fell. Her hand scrabbled for purchase against the slick walls of its throat, but to no avail. She was falling, plummeting down its gullet to her doom. helpless to do anything but slide down its throat. It was then that Mina Carolina knew her end was nigh. How was this happening? A foolish question, a stupid inquiry, the answer to which she already knew. She had been there with Aaron and the others atop the wall. She had seen the colossal titan, witnessed its destruction firsthand, been forced to watch helpless as it laid waste to the cannons kicked in the wall and let the titans in. She hadn't been able to do anything. All of those techniques Naruto had taught her, useless. She'd been far too afraid, too frightened to do anything. It had been 3 years since she trained, nearly 5 in total since the great catastrophe of Wall Maria. And now it was happening all over again. After that abnormal had eaten Thomas, everyone had just panicked. The titan had snapped her wire, sending her body hurtling into the side of a building dazed. She had tried to draw the kunai Naruto had given her, but she'd lost it somewhere during the chaos, her fingers only just brushing its hilt. At this moment Mina wished for more than anything to see her sensei again. But Naruto wasn't here. His duties with the Scouting Legion had practically removed him from her life in the last month. More and more he was becoming feared by the populace for his strange techniques, and even stranger transformations. If he didn't have the support of someone in the monarchy, he'd probably be dead already by now, or worse, thrust back outside, left to fend for himself. That was why I wanted to join the Legion. Not that it mattered anymore, they were all going to die. And so was she. Naruto's training had been for naught. No one could save her now, there was just no possible way. Mina! Her eyes drifted open. Mina Carolina! Abruptly, they widened. Why am I thinking about that now? Flashback. They stood there before the torches, faced by the man responsible for their own private hell for the last 3 years. It was to be the night of their graduation, not just as soldiers, but as shinobi. Mina had never been so happy in all of her life, and yet at the same time, she was said, this would be their last evening with Naruto. Tomorrow he would officially resume his duties as a member of the Scouting Legion. There would be no more training. Clearing his throat, the whiskered blonde began to speak. Mina Carolina, Mikasa Ackerman, Sasha Browse, Jean Kirchstein, Krista Rice, Annie Leonhardt, Armin Arlette, I am proud of each of you. Naruto's eyes glimmered with pride as he read off the list of names into the moonlight. 7 names, Armin Arlette was one of them. Mina had felt bad for him. He had a brilliant mind, but at the same time lacked a strong body to properly use it. Her father had always reproached her for this weakness. She was simply too kind of a person. As a child, she couldn't stand seeing people suffer. Her empathy had only grown with age. Yet another. That same empathy had stirred when she saw Armin. How despondent he'd looked as Naruto passed him by. The very next day she'd all but begged her new sensei to activate the boy's chakra coils as he'd done her own, and Naruto had, to great success. Like Mina, Armin had nearly lost his life countless times over the course of the last 3 years. There had been times when she was almost certain he'd drop out, but the boy had persevered, and as he stood here beside her now tall and proud, Mina Carolina knew at once that she had made a friend for life. You have far exceeded my expectations. Naruto continued, jerking her back to the present with a loud hiss, not just as soldiers, but as individuals, and as such, I will present to each of you a gift for exceeding. Mina blinked, baffled as their instructor revealed a line of tri-pronged kunai from his coat and began proffering it to each of them in turn. It can only be used once, so take care when holding it. A slight smile broke through his fierce facade, rendering his next words soft and kind. I know it sounds corny, but think of me when you need me most, and so long as you've touched that kunai, I'll be there. Consider it a one-time freebie, because, from this day on, I am no longer your teacher. We are equals. Brothers and sisters in arms. From this day forth. Just like that, he raised his voice again, his shout carrying over the 7 cadets. The 7 of you are shinobi. End flashback. That's right, Mina thought to herself as she slid still further down the titan's throat. I'm not just a soldier. I'm not just a shinobi, either. I'm Naruto's disciple. And I'm not going to die here. Her hands and feet stabbed into the lining of the titan's throat. No longer seeking a handhold, Mina simply thrust out her arms and legs and released all of her chakra in one monumental burst. Raw power bled from her broken fingertips and booted, grinding her rapid fall to a sudden halt, buying her precious time. Her mind raced for an answer, a million different thoughts racing through her head. Naruto had taught her a handful of his jutsu, her affinity being that of water, but she needed both hands for those, and was hardly adept in either of them. This far back the beast couldn't grab her, but it was taking all of her chakra just to remain rooted in place, and already she could feel her strength sapping, slipping. No! She hissed as she began to slide, slipping 1 inch, then another down its throat. Mina had just begun to scream, to damn herself for her powerlessness, when she heard it, a familiar roar peaking in her ears. Gradually it dissolved from a meaningless animal bleat to sound, someone screaming out at her, swearing a blue streak, spitting curse after endless curse, and over those curses, she heard a single familiar phrase being repeated over and over and over. Noya fucking didn't. Her would-be killer must have heard it too, because the Titan blinked once, its massive head turning a fraction of an inch, prolonging her life for just a sliver of a second. That was all it took. A gold and white blur streaked across Mina's vision, interposing itself firmly between her and the Titan's gaping maw, lunging into that black abyss to pull her back from the brink of oblivion. A hand locked around her wrist, squeezing with enough force to fracture the bone. Mina found herself staring up at a familiar whiskered face and blazing blue eyes, the words drying up in her throat as she recognized that shock of blonde hair and the unmistakable scent of warm bread. This was Aura! His hand shot forth like a pulley even as Titan's teeth snapped shut around them. Blood spurted into the air. But it wasn't Mina's blood, it was his. Her savior stood firm and strong, one hand propping open the Kaijin's mouth even as a booted foot arrested its lower jaw from moving any further. Try as it might, the giant couldn't get its mouth to shut. Its tongue wriggled restlessly as the man held its mouth open. A strong arm folded itself around Mina's waist and drew her up out of the dark, hauling her to safety. She could only gasp as they flung her out of the beast's mouth and into open air. Her back greeted the outer wall with a dull thud. See, he began slowly, this is why I hate you Titans. You're ugly, stupid, cruel, brutish. I could tolerate that, but this time, you assholes touched my precious disciples. His remaining palm raised itself up in silent offering, fingers clenched into a claw, clutched around spiraling sphere. Mina recognized it at once, because Naruto had taught her the very same technique. Rasengan, the Titan began to react to this sudden and more immediate threat, reaching a giant paw up at its mouth. Too little too late, Mina realized. Naruto struck forward with all his might, obliterating the Titan's hand with a single swing of the arm before bringing his arm back up towards its head. That was when its mouth snapped shut on him. Mina's last sight was that of her sensei's startled expression before the beast swallowed with a great gulp, sending the blonde plummeting down its gullet. No! Mina sat there on her knees, unable to believe her eyes. Naruto was gone. He'd leapt straight into the monster's maw to save her, and now he was gone, damned to death. No! And she had been the one responsible for it. No! Something snapped, deep inside of her. In that instant, Mina Carolina forgot all about what she'd been taught by Naruto. All those jutsu tactics and training were thrown to the wayside. There was only a burning red haze and a desire for vengeance. Vengeance. She'd idolized Naruto, seen him as a true soldier, and now he was gone. I never told him how I felt. She had never told him that her feelings ran deeper than those of a master-student bond. She'd secretly fallen in love with him sometime during the last 3 years. She'd kept quiet about it, had planned on telling him tomorrow when he returned from his expedition beyond the walls. But that would never happen now. He was gone, and it was all her fault. A raw scream ripped from her lips, a mournful cry of love lost, garnering the Titan's attention. It reached for her with its remaining hand, and her sword lashed out like lightning, its narrow edge carving a canyon in the beast's palm. Severing its index fingers and thumb, she darted past it, hurtling between its legs and out the other side. It bent down to look at her between those legs, and that was when Mina saw it, an opening. Her body was in the air almost before she realized it, her maneuver gear carrying her unfalteringly toward its neck, her blades swinging down upon its lone vulnerable area in a vicious and violent arc. Mina screamed at the Titan as she struck, expelling all her pent-up feelings in one monumental burst of energy. Die, you bastard! Her sword cut deep and true, almost slicing the neck off in its entirety. Blood spattered across her face, but she couldn't have cared less. This was it, her first kill. She'd avenged Naruto-sensei. The Titan stood there for a long moment, eyes wide and disbelieving, as though it couldn't believe that it had actually been slain by a rookie like her, and then it began to fall. Pitching backwards to land on its back, Mina dropped down after it, her dark eyes leering angrily at the Titan's still form, fighting back furious tears. Now that she'd avenged Naruto, the anger was gone. All that remained was sorrowed resolve. She would not let his sacrifice go to waste. "Thank you for saving me, Sensei," she whispered. "I promise I won't let you down." And she wouldn't, she would slaughter every single Titan. As if in answerment, a deep rumble arose from the Tiran's gut, prompting Mina to risk a second glance back at the belly of the beast. Was it still alive? No, that was impossible. She'd given it a clean cut across the nape of its neck, so what was happening with its stomach? Another rumble reverberated from the creature's belly, causing its corpse to convulse. It sounded almost like something was shrieking inside of it, growing louder in each passing second. Raisin Shuriken. A body erupted out of the Titan's stomach in an explosion of gore. Blade in hand, Mina froze. She could see the current of wind swirling in his palm, spitting sparking as the jutsu extinguished itself. His feet had barely touched the ground before she recognized him. Although his hair was slicked with slime and his body greased with gore, there was no way she could have mistaken him for someone else. Those blazing blue eyes, roaring high with the flame of defiance, the wings of freedom emblazoned proudly upon his great green cloak. "Naruto-sensei," she kanonied into him without a second thought, her arms locking around his waist and holding tight. He was alive. He was covered in gore and stank something fierce, but he was alive. And wait, something was not quite right. She felt as though she should be holding more of him than she was. Her arms wrapped around both of his, and yet she felt only one. "I owe you one, Mina." He touched a hand to the lone kunai still dangling around her neck. "If it weren't for you, I'd never have made it back here in time." Mina felt the tears well up in her eyes. This time she was powerless to stop them. Naruto noticed. "Hey, don't cry now, you did well, Naruto, but... The blonde blinked. "Your arm." Indeed, Uzumaki Naruto had lost his left limb. All that remained below the shoulder was a ragged stump, dripping droplets of blood. It was gone, forever. He gave the stump a precursory glance as though only noticing it now for the first time. Mina tensed, expecting an outburst for her concern. Instead, her sensei smiled. "It isn't worth much," Naruto soothed, stroking her hair with his hand. "Besides, it's just one arm. I'm glad you're safe, though. I could hear everything from inside the Titan's stomach. That was your first kill, wasn't it? Great job." A pained grin pulled at his whiskered cheeks, draw up in a smile that sent her heart fluttering. "I'm proud of you, Mina, as sensei." Mina started to cry then, all her pent-up feelings leaking through her eyes and down her cheeks. Naruto said nothing to this. He simply tucked her head into his chest with his remaining arm and held her, allowing her to bury her head in his cloak for what felt like an eternity. "Nay, sensei. I want to tell you something." Naruto didn't reply. He merely looked at her, as though awaiting the question. In the end, she couldn't say it after all. "And no, never mind, it can wait." Armin Arlert heard the sound of footsteps drawing nearer, but he daren't move. He heard voices calling for him, saying name, and even then, he did nothing, said nothing. Eren would have done something, said something to reassure them, but Eren wasn't here, not anymore. He was gone, dead, devoured by the Titan. It should have been me. He should have been the one to die, not Eren. A useless burden like him could do anything, and he had just gotten all of his friends killed. "Min, I'm worthless, I want to die." "Armin." Eventually he became aware of movement on his right, in his peripherals, that someone was shaking him now, their hands wrapping around his shoulders. "Armin! Snap out of it." Gradually his vision resolved into blurs, then shadows, then finally a figure. He caught sight of a familiar button nose set in a pale face and dark, empathetic eyes, her visage framed by dark ebony tresses. At first Armin thought it was Mikasa, but no, Mikasa didn't have long hair anymore. This one did. She was shaking him roughly now, pleading for an answer. "Mina?" He almost didn't recognize her with her hair down. Wait, Mina never ever wore her hair down. He must be dreaming then. This was all a dream. That must be it. "Armin!" Slap! A painful open hand smack across his face rocked him back to painful reality. He blinked back the stinging tears, his vision finally resolving into a meaningful image. He found himself staring back at a bedraggled face, a body that looked as though it had just taken a bath in gore and blood. But even so, despite her disparaged state, he didn't fail to recognize her. "Mina Carolina. Mina, you're alive?" But he'd seen her get eaten. His friend opened her mouth to reply, but someone else beat her to it. "Of course she is." Armin stiffened at the sound of a familiarly gruff voice, And so are you, lad. Did you really think I would let any harm come to my precious disciples? The boy started at the reminder, surprised to find Naruto standing tall there behind him, his whiskered visage set in the slyest of scowls. He was covered in blood and slime, and his right arm was missing. But he was still very much alive. He'd never been more happy to see him in all his life. If there is anyone who could drive the Titans out of the walls, then it was definitely Wait. Sensei, your arm. Oh, this? Naruto glanced at the severed stump of his shoulder, still trickling blood. Like I told Mina, it's just one arm, nothing serious. Besides, with a grunt the inexplicable occurred. A fresh limb sprouted from the detritus of his ruined arm. Naruto stared at his sleeveless limb for a long moment, flexing his fingers. Armin didn't even bother to question it, neither did Mina. They'd seen their fair share of oddities and ends from their teacher in these last 3 years. The growth of a new limb didn't shock them anywhere near as much as it should have. Naruto, was this man really only human as he'd claimed to be? Armin didn't think so. More and more he was beginning to think of his master as some kind of monster. That was not to say he feared him, however. Oh, no! This was one monster he would gladly welcome at any time. Just having Naruto in the immediate vicinity was enough to bolster his confidence, to make him want to stand up and fight again. Where's the rest of your squad? Naruto turned his head, searchingly. There should have been 4 more of you. Armin saw Mina pale out of the corner of his eye. Doubtless she was experiencing the horror of watching of everyone get slaughtered again. Drat. He'd started thinking about it again. Just like that, it all came rushing back. The deaths, Thomas, Eren, all the others. Eren. What about Eren? Naruto frowned. Has that crazy bastard killed any Titans yet? No. Then where the hell is he? His sensei demanded. Out with it, boy. He was eaten, sir. Eaten? For a heartbeat Naruto's face blanked, his eyes draining of all emotion. Then they drifted shut, his lids dusting with orange. Seconds later, Armin's excellent mind recalled it as Sage Mode. Supposedly it gave Naruto fine-tuned sensory abilities, including the sensing of life. He'd yet to teach it to any of them, citing its many risks. But even so, Armin wondered what his fellow blonde was attempting. Was he trying to track down that Titan so he could slaughter it? He'd taught him how to fight after all, so it would make sense if he— Well, I'll be damned. Naruto's sudden announcement caught both Armin and Mina off guard. He's still alive. Then more softly. I didn't think he was like me. That's not possible, sensei. Armin argued, refusing to cling to false hope. I was there. Just trust me on this, kid, came the curt reply. Eren will be fine. Right now, we need to worry about ourselves. Trust you? But Naruto would say no more. Anyway, it's about time we did something about this, he decided suddenly, his head snapping toward the south. I can sense a lot of people over there. Without another word he leapt off the roof, his maneuver gears launching him across the sky in a cloud of wind. That's right. Armin remembered. Naruto doesn't use gas to propel himself. He uses the wind. Thanks to his immense reserve of chakra and natural affinity for air itself, a gas-propelled tank wasn't needed. So long as he had wires, he could traverse the city without fear of running out of fuel. If anything, it made him even deadly than he 3 years before when he was without the 3D maneuver gear. Then when one recalled his abilities as a master shinobi with almost limitless jutsu, and no need to worry about a limited blade supply, he really is built for killing Titans. Let's go, Armin. Mina was suddenly ahead of him, rappelling after the rapidly retreating blonde. We don't want to be left behind. Hi. Together they took off after Naruto. It was only when the latter slowed his pace that they were able to catch him. What are you planning, sensei? Armin was hesitant to ask. He knew Naruto well enough by now to know that the blonde's plans were often well-conceived and disastrous for those he plotted against. Alas, his only response was to laugh. Once more, Mina Carolina was reminded just how much admired and why she secretly loved this soldier standing before her. It wasn't just his good looks, although those were certainly a factor. It was his charisma. He was as much a man of words as he was action. His very presence could inspire dozens to do the acts of thousands. And then there was that foxy grin on his face. Yes, this was why she loved Uzumaki Naruto, and why she could never tell him. What could someone so extraordinary possibly want with someone so ordinary as her? Sensei? She asked once more, echoing Armin's question. You said it was time for something? What exactly might that be? Naruto's grin looked like it belonged on Lucifer himself, to mount our counterattack. Jean! What do we do now? What can we do? Jean Kirchstein hung his head low, refusing to encourage Connie any further. We finally received the order to retreat, but we can't get over the wall because we're out of gas, and my chakra's so low right now that I'd probably only make it up halfway. We're all going to die thanks to those fucking cowards in the support squad. He gazed up at the dark skies overhead. It looked as though it was going to rain any moment now. Damn! He felt so pathetic right now, absolutely wrecked. Most of the survivors had gathered here on the rooftops. There were only a few dozen remaining out of the hundreds that had been sent out to exterminate the Titans. Granted, he'd helped to save a few, but in doing so, he'd all but exhausted his reserves. Chakra-enhanced speed could only save so many after all. A nagging sense of guilt silently condemned him for the many he hadn't been able to save. Completely pathetic. He hadn't changed at all. Back then, he'd volunteered for the training solely to impress Mikasa. It hadn't worked. He should have known she only had eyes for the instructor. He'd gotten a few skills out of it, true, but his outlook on life had yet to change. If only they had waited one more day. Then he would have been safe in the interior with the military police. That's why we have to go all in on those Titans. Connie would not be denied. Their only way out was to race into the headquarters, deal with them, and retrieve the gas. The only other option was to avoid them until they eventually ran out of gas. And that meant death. No matter what option they took, they were still screwed. Damn it all. He swore, this is hopeless. Sasha Browse was of the exact opposite opinion. She knew from first-hand experience that, let's do it. She urged her fellow recruits, stand up. If we all work together, we can do it. I'll be in front. It's your business if you want to get yourself killed. Potato Girl, don't drag us into it, one of them murmured. Her enthusiasm was met with despondent looks and sorrowed faces. All those gathered here had lost someone to the Titans. They'd survived through pure luck or outright cowardice. Sasha herself was one of the lucky few that had managed to escape the worst of it all. A testament to Naruto's harsh training, he'd praised her for two things: her endless appetite and her unbelievable physical endurance. Compared to Jean, he'd called her a living example of a Jonin once. Her affinity for Earth gave her nearly limitless reserves of stamina. Come on now, yet again, she tried to rouse them to action. If we all work together, I'm sure we can. Shut up, you elitist! Accused another. You had that special training. We didn't. Are you planning to leave us behind so you can scale the wall yourself? Sasha opened her mouth to deny that fact, and just as quickly snapped it shut. They were right, she hadn't used any of her chakra yet. If she really wanted to, she could easily run up the wall to safety. So why hadn't she? Only a handful of these people were known to her. She had no real obligations to any of them now that the order to retreat had been sounded. With her speed she could easily outrun any Titan on her own, so that definitely wasn't fear holding her back. So, why was she still standing around? Oh, I wish Sensei were here. Wish granted. Well now, I see a bunch of idle hands standing around, heads snapped up like puppets severed from their strings. Spooked by the sound of that authoritative voice, Sasha and Jean simultaneously stiffened, because they knew that voice. Its owner had made these last 3 years of their lives absolute hell. They stood straight and erect as Uzumaki Naruto dropped down from the skies with a snarl, his boots biting into the rooftop tiles with a harsh crunch. Armin and Mina landed behind him seconds later, their faces carefully blank. Sasha had to forcibly restrain herself from running to him. Naruto radiated confidence on an almost primal level. Now that he was here to take command, the burden of having their lives wouldn't fall on her. What the hell are you doing, Jean? He growled, advancing on his student. I taught you better than this. But nothing was what he'd expected to hear. Instead, his mentor simply glowered at him for a long moment, then he sighed. You did well to survive, Naruto said at last, knocking his disciple once upon the noggin. Rest easy. I'll take things from here. Without another word he moved on past him to speak with Annie. Then the others. Sasha almost couldn't believe it. He'd completely ignored her. Sasha. Hi. She stiffened in expectation. But it was not Naruto who had called out her name, it was Mikasa. She'd just enough time to see the raven-haired girl descend from a rooftop, nearly crashing into her in her haste to land safely before she found herself accosted by her fell trainee. Have you seen Aaron's unit? She asked. No, Sasha shook her head, but Naruto-sensei's over there with Armin and Mikasa shot past her like an arrow loose from a bow. Mina, she finished in disbelief. Geez, she's quick. Naruto. The blonde turned, not at all alarmed to find his most talented student approaching him at a run. It seemed most of the survivors had gathered here after all, and now Mikasa was amongst them. Good. He expected no less from his star pupil. What he wasn't expecting was for her to grab his hand. Beside him, Mina bristled. I thought you were outside the walls. Surprise, surprise, the blonde held up Mina's spent Hiraishi kunai from the necklace around her neck. You can thank her that I'm here at all. I managed to warn the Legion. So they should be here before nightfall. She really saved your skins. Mina flushed, her indignation momentarily forgotten in the wake of this unexpected praise. It was nothing, sensei. Don't dismiss yourself so easily. Naruto laughed, drawing her close. If you hadn't used that kunai, most of them probably wouldn't be alive right now. Armin, have you seen Eren? Mikasa chose that moment to ask the one question no one wanted to hear. Mina's smile shattered like so much glass. Crap. Armin thought to himself, how can I look her in the face and tell her what happened? We were separated from him. Naruto cut in smoothly. He knew Mikasa. She cared for her brother more than anything. Ordinarily, that wouldn't have been a problem. But with her newfound skill set, not to mention the unhealthy amount of chakra she'd taken from Kurama 3 years ago, her emotional state was a cause for concern. The last thing he needed was a destabilized killer on his hands. He didn't have the time or the energy to suppress her if she went on a rampage now, and with Kurama's chakra trapped in her coils, that was a very distinct possibility. He's alive, Naruto reassured her. I know it. That suicidal bastard's probably out there killing titans as we speak. Mikasa looked as though she wanted to say more, but she chose to accept his words. After all, Naruto would never lie to her, right? No, of course not. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she almost missed the blonde's relieved sigh. Why had he done that? When he placed his hand upon her shoulder, however, all her worries and concerns simply ceased to be. It was like flicking a switch. Trust me on this, all right? He said softly. As soon as we wipe out the titans at the supply depot, I'll help you look for him. Understood? Hi, sensei. Crisis averted. Damn, I woulda liked to see her go crazy. The kitsune sulked, sullenly. She's keeping an awful lot of emotion tamped down in there. Now's not the time for that, and you know it. I don't feel like fending off a mini-you at the moment. So? His partner challenged. Just how do you intend to get these fools up and running, then? Like this? Or Mikasa? His star prodigy turned. Is this everyone who hasn't made it over the wall? I think so. Good. Naruto was already striding forward, reaching for his sword. Then if that's the case, we don't need to wait any longer. Listen up, maggots. Naruto thrust his blade high, commanding the attention of all assembled there. I know you're afraid. Some of you may even be terrified. That is understandable. You're weak, but I am strong. I will protect each of you with my life. I swear this on my Nindo. Stand behind me and I will lead you to victory. Our counterattack begins now, but in order for it to succeed, I'll need your help. Silence reigned supreme. It seemed not even Naruto's presence could galvanize them. Jean thought to himself, he was after all, only human, right? Lowering his blade, the blonde sighed and crossed his hands together in an all too familiar shape. Tajukage Bunshin no Jutsu. A plume of smoke echoed his words, one that dissipated just as quickly, revealing a startling sigh. There was a silence as the cadets beheld these sudden and unexpected reinforcements. They'd each witnessed this jutsu firsthand on their very first day of training, but not like this. Instead of summoning 6 clones, he'd created dozens, each armed with maneuver gear and weapons, same as the original. They lined the streets around them, perched upon towers, stood upon rooftops, swarming the area for miles around. Gasps arose up from the cadets. No one had been expecting so many to appear upon his command. Are you with me? They demanded as one. Speak now, or stay here and die. As one they set out, each of them diverging in separate directions until only the original remained. He wasn't about to babysit them. Some would die no matter what he did. He and his clones would protect these cadets as best they could. That was all he could do. They were only human after all. But being human, as he'd come to discover, wasn't quite so bad after all. He turned his head, catching Mikasa's eye, holding her gaze in silent obscurity, knowing at once that she would follow him if he stepped off this rooftop, perhaps even to her death. Most of these recruits did not know what they were getting into. yet he'd still chosen to shoulder the responsibility of their lives anyway. Those with the will to live and fight for tomorrow, follow me now. Without another word he erupted into motion, hurtling into the air, refusing to look back. He'd done all he could, the rest was up to them. If only Erwin and the others weren't so far away, they likely wouldn't make it back to the wall until evening. Until then, the task fell to him to keep these kids alive. No pressure, right? Did I mention I love your sense of humor? Ha! It wasn't long before they caught movement in their peripherals. Evidently his words had an effect after all. It was only when that same movement resolved itself into the shape of a titan that Naruto realized he might have underestimated the fear his students had felt. They were probably still back there, knees knocking together. Or not! Laughter leapt from his lips as the titan died behind him. All without so much as raising a finger in his direction. He didn't have to look back to know who had slain it. A puff of gas resounded in his ears, followed by a shock of familiar blonde hair, and then she was there, gliding next to him as though she'd always been there. Idiot, Annie mumbled as she came to drift beside him, her cold crystal eyes boring into his. Was that honestly supposed to inspire us back there? You're here now, aren't you? TCH. She turned aside, trying to escape his gaze. It's just because I want to be the one to kill you. Hi, whatever helps you sleep at night, Naruto replied as their gear carried them around a corner. So, what got you moving? You can thank that ace student of yours, his fellow blonde grumbled. She got everyone moving. I'm just the first to catch up to you. Oh? Flashback. It was like flicking a switch, Annie realized. Murmurs of confusion warped into whispers of approval from those remaining. Everyone was suddenly glancing this way and that, all too aware that their best chance of survival had just flown on ahead of them. With Naruto and his clones gone, what chance did they stand against the Titans? You're either incompetent or spineless cowards. Mikasa snapped, diving after him almost immediately. Within seconds she was little more than a speck on the horizon, a trail of gas the only sign that she'd ever been there at all. Armin sniffed and scrubbed at his face with the back of a hand. Seconds later, he too was sailing through the air after her, not one to be outdone by her fellow students. Mina was swift to join them. Annie just begun to move herself when Jean sighed somewhere beside her. She could read his face like an open book, anger, frustration at his own powerlessness. Any minute now and he'd say something. Were we trained to let our comrades fight alone? At this rate, we're going to turn out to be spineless cowards. With a roar he lunged after Mina, his cry carrying on into the distance. Didn't expect to hear that from him, Reiner murmured. Guess we might as well lend a hand. That did it. Hey! Cowards! Weaklings! Retards! Sasha was the next to leap into oblivion, racing after their mentor. End flashback. So? She asked. I take it you have a plan to keep us alive? Don't I always? I'm not even going to dignify that with a response. Here they come. Both blondes turned to regard the one who had spoken. The latter was lightly amused to find that it was Sasha who had spoken. Taking Naruto's flank, Annie didn't envy her that position. Although the skies were swiftly growing black with the bodies of the recruits, so too were the streets filling with titans. The behemoths now attracted by the presence of so many humans in one area. If Naruto didn't do something soon, this might be a mass ace after all. There he went. Scatter and advance at all costs. Naruto shouted. Don't slow down, not even for an instant, or they'll catch you. His words carried on ahead of her as the vanguard finally reached the first wave of titans. Then there was only blood and battle. Some weren't quick enough to heed his command. 6 recruits were caught or dead before they knew what had happened. Everything seemed to move very slowly after that. It was almost as if the gods themselves had stopped to take personal notice of the carnage unfolding in the streets. Mikasa was quick to distinguish herself amongst the combatants, effortlessly slaying 3 titans without even pausing to adjust her course. Mina, to Annie's surprise, proved exact opposite. The once shy and reserved girl now struck out at titans with borderline reckless behavior. Armin actually gained his first kill in that battle. Despite being scared half to death by the carnage raging around him, Marco and Berthold nearly got eaten for their reckless stunts. Jean and Reiner were forced to double back just to save their comrades. Others weren't quite so fortunate. Annie cringed. A girl beside was snared out of the air by a titan, its massive fist crushing her body to a pulp. Ahead of her a boy lost control of his maneuver gear and flew right into a titan's maw. His screams echoed in her ears as she rushed past, knowing it would mean death to attempt to rescue. She could see the fury etched into their faces. they're powerless at knowing their fate. Naruto's clones proved an admirable distraction, but there's simply too many titans for him to save everyone. Where we all these titans coming from? With each loss, Naruto became more and more aggressive. He simply tore through whomever and whatever barred his way. There was no subtlety or grace in his movements, and he realized he'd taken advantage of his nearly immortal body and used it to devastating effect. His chakra allowed him to make savage turns that would have torn most men in half, his hands and blades ripping into any giant foolish enough to accost him. And there were many who dared do just that. Aberrants drawn to him by his unique chakra, eager to devour him, swallow him whole, they all died. Whether by blade or fist or raisin shuriken, he cut them down, uncaring for what happened to his body. Annie soon lost track of his count altogether. It had to be somewhere in the 50s by now. He truly is a beast, she thought to herself. Sheathed in that strange golden shroud of his, he simply weathered their attacks and eviscerated their bodies into unrecognizable shapes. He became little more than a blur, working harder and harder to preserve the ever-dwindling number of cadets under his command. Advance! He commanded those remaining. Do not waste the sacrifices of your fallen comrades. Advance! Yes, sir! Annie had to hand it to him. Naruto really did know how to take command of a situation. He allowed them no time for grief, ushering them ever onward before their feelings of regrets and sorrow could overcome them and leave their bodies crippled with fear. 3 more died before they reached the halfway point, before Naruto finally skidded to a halt on a rooftop and flung out a hand. All units! Halt! Boots skidded and tiles crunched as the 20 remaining recruits of the original 30 slid to a halt beside and behind him. Wondering why he'd called them to stop, they soon saw why. 2 titans were headed in their direction, each easily larger than 14 meters each. One wasn't even worthy of mention with its spindly frame. The other, however, proved another matter entirely. What the hell was that? No sudden movements, Naruto warned, leaving Annie to question his judgment once more. Ignoring the adrenaline pounding in her ears, she risked a glance at the second titan. Muscled from head to toe, it cut an imposing figure amidst the carnage, striding forward with thick footfalls, utterly uncaring of everything in its path. Wait, if it continued, its path would eventually take it right past their vantage point. Annie got a better look at it as it stormed forward, its shaggy brown hair obscuring pointed ears and furious angry eyes. It was truly a fearsome thing to behold up close. Its square jaw divided open as it neared them, its mouth creaking apart with a ponderous creaking. Sasha whimpered softly to herself at the sight, unnerving several recruits. We should kill it! Mina hissed quickly, before it gets any closer. Steady, Naruto said, raising his hand for calm. Steady. Still closer it came, bounding forward with its inexorable stride. Sensei! Sasha squealed. Steady. And then, just when Annie was absolutely certain they were going to die a fool's death because of this blonde baka of a captain, to their disbelief and his satisfaction, the 15-meter titan broke into a run and bounded right past them, never once sparing them so much as a second glance. Annie felt her mouth drift open, her lips forming a silent O as the 15-meter type canonied into its fellow titan with all the force of a hurricane. They grappled with one another for a brief instant. It soon became apparent that the abnormal-looking one held the advantage in terms of strength alone, if not skill. Rah! Breaking free, it lashed out like an axe, clenched knuckles slamming into the smaller titan's head, all but launching its skull from its shoulders in a grisly gout of gore. The recruits watched, disbelieving, as the severed skull crashed into a building miles away, its grotesque visage twisted in the agony of its last moments. Its body seemed to have other plans, however. The headless figure made a singular attempt to rise before the titan stomped down on the nape of its neck, ending its life. What the hell? Jean hissed angrily. Did that fucker just finish it off? Armin finished with a gasp, disbelieving. But how did it know about the titan's weakness? Connie frowned. It must be an abnormal. Naruto's lips curved up in a slight, secret smile. That a boy, Eren. So I'm guessing it's time for the second phase? Pretty much. Jean! He shouted. You're in charge. Get them to the supply tower quickly. I'll meet up with you once I've finished up here. His words had a rippling effect on the others. Why was he suddenly leaving? It didn't make any sense. None at all. Was he abandoning them? Leaving them to their fate so he could scale the wall on his own? Why me? Jean gaped. We were doing just fine with you in charge. Huh! Naruto growled. Is the student questioning the teacher again? No, I mean, no sir. Then hop to it. He snapped, I'm counting on you. Annie! You're with me. We'll help that abnormal suppress the titans around the tower. I can help too, I'll be fine. The blonde waved Mikasa's concerns aside, ignoring her as she edged forward. You're needed elsewhere. Annie, and I don't need gas to maneuver. But, Mikasa! Go! The blackhead hesitated a moment longer, torn between duty and decision, then she darted forward, placing a swift kiss upon his lips. Her mouth seemed stuck there, as though she would never pull away. There was a silence, one swiftly broken. Choking gasps arose out of the recruits. They couldn't believe their eyes. Mikasa had just kissed the instructor. Such a thing was unheard of, even here in this time of crisis. She dash. Mina gaped. Kissed him? Sasha was of the same mind. So was Annie. What the hell, Mikasa? Please don't die, sensei, Mikasa whispered as she pulled away. Her cheeks burnished the faintest shade of pink, and then she was gone whisking off into the distance before anyone could question what she had done at all. Naruto was left standing there, eyes and mouth working wordlessly. For the first time in the last 3 years, he truly was without words. What the hell? He hadn't been expecting that. No one could have expected that. How was he supposed to cope with the sudden knowledge that he'd been kissed by the same girl he'd spent the last 3 years training? Granted, the age gap between them had shrunk to only a year now, but a kiss? What the hell was he supposed to say to that? How about Booyah, Urusei? I feel the same. Before he knew what was happening, Mina was there flowing like the water that was her element, flinging her arms round his neck. Thankfully, her lips found his cheek, not his face. Please, don't take any unnecessary risks, teacher. She pleaded softly before disengaging and rappelling away. Good luck, sensei. Armin saluted against his chest and took off after Mina. Sasha was the next to approach him. Browse you too? Naruto groaned. What the hell is this? Worship Naruto Day. I'm not complaining. Of course you're not, you lecherous fox. But Sasha didn't kiss him. She simply wrapped her arms around his chest and squeezed as tightly as she could, burying her face in his jacket. It was only then that he realized she was crying. Sobbing into the fabrics of his cloak and shirt, she held tight to him, as though to release him meant the end of her. I'm very grateful for everything you taught me. She gasped out, diving towards the tower before he could utter so much as a word. Jean was the next and very last to confront him, leaving the blonde to hope Krista and Emer had somehow been able to make it over the wall. If they hadn't, are you sure about this? He glanced at the dozens of titans swarming the square, growing closer with each passing instant. Soon they'd be overrun. Oh, you guys are acting like I'm gonna die or something. Naruto forced a rough laugh. Get out of here, you slacker. Do your job. Just be careful, teach. I don't want to hear that from someone like you. Naruto watched, quietly and patiently waiting as the cadets flung themselves off the rooftop, hurtling towards, then through the windows of the supply depot. Only when he was certain that they'd made their escape did he finally turn to face Annie. She was giving him an icy glare that could have put Haku to shame. Was she jealous? Why did you want me to stay with you? She demanded to know as they leapt to another rooftop, away from the encroaching horde. You would have been of better use in there. Naruto shook his head, clearing himself of confusion, and offered a lopsided smile. I wanted to discuss the coordinate. Also know as that titan over there. He indicated the rogue titan with a finger, still rampaging against the other titans in the face of all overwhelming odds. I'm willing to wager you know who it is, don't you? Within a heartbeat he felt the killer intent. She was angry. No, she was beyond angry. She was pissed. Ho, that's some fine killing intent you have there, Naruto tittered softly. You only have yourself to blame. You talk in your sleep. After all, for the first time since he'd met her, Annie Leonhardt actually flushed. The slow coloring of her face left her literally unable to speak. You snuck into my room? Just once last month, Naruto shrugged. Boy was I surprised. I had no idea you liked to sleep in. I swear I'll kill you. Relax, I was bluffing. He grinned. That was just a guess. But by all means, thanks for the information. Annie grimaced, refusing to speak. She'd been had. Once again she'd underestimated Naruto's intelligence. She really didn't like where this was going, not at all. Why, I already know, Naruto continued. It's Eren, of course. I knew it the moment I realized he was still alive. Only a Titan can survive in another Titan's stomach. He must have transformed and tore his way out of there in order to escape. I understand that. What I don't understand is how or where he got that from. He's had the ability for quite some time now, it's merely been dormant inside him. Don't you find it strange? How would a boy like him suddenly gain the ability to shift like you and me? Annie refused to answer. Ryarg. Both blondes turned at the sound of the scream, alarmed to find the rogue Titan Eren howling in pain. The reason for his agony became quite obvious as they beheld the other Titans continuing to chew upon it. Having lost both of its limbs since they last looked, it seemed almost certain he would die for real this time, and the coordinate with him. Her mind made up, Annie drew her blade. Maddened with fury, Eren bounded forward. Despite all the Titans weighing him down, he had eyes for one last target, and abnormal that unbeknownst to Annie was responsible for devouring Thomas hours before. With a scream that put the gods to shame, Eren shook himself free of his captors and with one final leap locked tight his jaw around the creature's neck. Still screaming, he hoisted its spindly body high, then higher still, until the only thing holding it aloft was his jaw strength alone, his broad teeth biting deep into the nape. His gaze snapped towards those he had shaken off, eyes green and narrow. With a single swing of the dead body he flattened them, grinding their bodies to bloody smears in the streets. Then straightening, he dropped from his crouch and swung again, tossing its body into an approaching Titan, sending both beasts crashing through a nearby building, steam spurting from his jaws. Eren dropped what little remained of the neck, leering in the direction in which he'd thrown Thomas's killer. Naruto whistled. Did he just beat that motherfucker with another motherfucker? Ruarg! Eren threw back his head and roared for a final time, howling his fury to the heavens, sending the earth itself shaking. Then his eyes rolled back, his body sank forward, crashing to his knees, plowing face first into the dirt. It did not rise again. He must have finally burned himself out, and he realized, even as a Titan, one only had so much stamina, and still other Titans were coming. There had to be hundreds of them now, drawn by the close concentration of humans and Naruto's irresistible life force. This was bad. If they reached Eren's body and devoured him before he could be extracted, then Annie started towards him, just a little, but it was more than enough to confirm her mentor's suspicions. I knew it. Naruto's smile grew another inch. For whatever reason, your objective is, and always has been, Eren. That got an answer out of her. What are you going to do? Naruto laughed. What do you think I'm gonna do? Annie didn't have a chance to answer, because at that very instant, a giant hand closed around her mentor. It came from out of nowhere, lunging across the rooftops to grab him, its massive fingers squeezing down in the blink of an eye, binding both arms to his sides. Everything happened so swiftly. Even as Annie reached for her blade, her mentor was hoisted high off the ground and brought towards the creature's mouth. Blue eyes widened hopelessly, powerlessly, as its jaws creaked open wide. Siniva. Naruto didn't hesitate either. He bit down on his lower lip, drawing blood even as the Titan began to stuff him into his maw. Bakram! At this distance Annie was nearly blown back off her feet by the transformation. The wind threatened to pick her up and launch her into the air. Naruto's Titan form burst out of the smoke in all its towering glory, 6 hands locking around the Titan's face and neck. Cruel crimson eyes leered down at the beast that had tried and failed to devour him. His fanged maw curved back in a warped facade of a smile as he gazed upon his prey. A soft sigh plugged itself between his teeth, building in volume until finally, Rula. Jean glanced up as the building shook around them, trembling at its very foundations. What was that noise just now? It had sounded familiar, almost like nah, that wasn't possible. Naruto wasn't a Titan, right? What a stupid thought! Shaking his head of such thoughts, they were in the midst of planning to take their gas back, thanks to Armin's plan. But without Naruto and Annie this involved an awful lot of risk. Now that they had all but run out of gas, they had to gamble everything on this plan, armed with only shotguns and blades. Why the hell did he put me in charge? He wondered aloud as he loaded the rifle. It's not like I'm cut out for this sort of thing. Just the thought of it made him wonder why he'd put up with this crap to begin with. Naruto had always been there from the start, always pushing him for more, always forcing him to strive then excel until finally the day came when he reached the top 10 graduates. Naruto had pushed himself out of himself, and Jean hated him for that. He was making him think, try, strive to be more than he could ever be, when he really wanted only to live safely in the interior. Damn him for being so persistent. For pushing him into this leadership role. Another tremor shook the building, closer this time. Oh, just what's going on out there? He wondered aloud. Naruto, Annie, you'd better not get yourselves killed and leave me in charge here, damn it. Annie Leonhardt had never felt so conflicted in all her life. It had only been 5 minutes since Naruto had transformed, since the rogue titan had fallen, and already, she knew the outcome. Even for all his speed and power and might, even with Eren's rampage having slaughtered so many, Naruto simply couldn't hope to handle the titans on his own. Slowly, but surely, he was being overwhelmed. An arm here, a leg there, it didn't matter how swiftly he regenerated, or that he was easily the largest titan for miles around. There were dozens of them, and only one of him. It was a testament to his incredible fighting skills that he'd lasted this long without support, that he was even alive at all. But Annie could see the end in sight now. He was finished. He just didn't know it yet. Naruto couldn't do both. He couldn't defend the building, himself, and Eren's prone titan form, not at the same time, even with all those arms. If he only had to worry about himself, then maybe he'd be alright. But with so many lives at stake, and so much to protect, he was hard-pressed to meet the task, too pressed. She watched him thrash around with gusto, crushing 2 titans against one another with his bare palms, his remaining arms working tirelessly to fend off the horde even as it worked to stream around him. He wouldn't be able to keep this up for much longer. Regeneration only counted for so much after all. Why doesn't he just use his other form? If he transformed into that monstrous kitsune, then those things wouldn't stand a chance. He'd crush them in an instant along with the rest of the town and any survivors who might be hiding nearby. It was then and only then that Annie truly understood. Naruto could easily shift into his Bijou form. He'd simply chosen not to, knowing that he might trample innocents and buildings underfoot. It made sense that he would his smaller, but by no means less deadly titan form, the same form that was slowly getting ripped to pieces by those titans. You idiot! Annie knew she should hate him for what he'd done to her. This boy had nearly made titan feed out of her 3 years before. Since then he'd kept a close eye on her at all times, despite bringing her up, despite all but entrusting her with his most powerful techniques. And yet there had been times when he was kind, caring, even. He was a ruthless teacher but also a goofball, a hopeless klutz when it came to using the 3D maneuver gear. His skills so poor that she'd actually had to teach him how to use it while he was teaching her. It was almost laughable. No, it was laughable. Yes, she hated him, loathed him, abhorred his very existence. But she hated even more to see him die, to watch a good man die when he didn't have to. It no longer mattered if he possessed the coordinate or not now anymore. She'd already made up her mind. She didn't want him to die, and she knew what she had to do. Annie tugged at her collar and wrapped her lower face in cloth, hoping it might better serve to hide her identity. Without looking back she loped into an alleyway, ducking into the first door available. Silently praying for his safety, she set about wrapping her face with strips of cloth, completely obscuring her visage. Even then she could still hear his struggle raging outside, the battle he was bound to lose if someone didn't do something to help him. She could be that someone, she could do something. But what about her mission? At the last instant she hesitated. She couldn't risk being discovered, and if she were, who knew what Bertholdt or Reiner might do to her? But if she didn't do something, and soon, damn it! Annie placed both fingers in her mouth and, visualizing her goal, bit down, hard. Save him, she had to save him. Consequences be damned. Foul ichor spurted into her mouth, causing her to gag back on her own blood for a terrifying instant as she awaited the transformation. But nothing happened. Nothing at all. Oh no, 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 no! Not now! Her feelings, her duty to her people were getting in the way. Again. Shrieking in frustration, bit down again, nearly severing her thumbs in the process. Come on! She nearly screamed, come on! Unbidden, her mind flashed back to those very words. Flashback. Come on! Naruto stood over her, laughing. Another round, another victory, another loss. Annie lay there, looking up at him, struggling not to shout. How many times did that make it now? She didn't want to remember. Time and time again he knocked her down, and time again, he demanded that she stand back up. You have an amazing technique, he complimented her. Who taught you? My father, she supplied sullenly. So your old man could. Who cares? Annie snapped at him, glowering as she found her footing. Doing this is pointless. I can't beat you as I am now, and besides, anti-personnel techniques don't factor into our scores anyway. She indicated the other cadets with a glance. many of whom weren't even trying at all. So, everyone just takes it easy until it's over. I'm sure a big, suicidal bastard like you wouldn't know this. But the right to join the military police and live in the secure inner district is only granted to the top scoring 10 graduates. The only people who bother participating in this are either stupidly serious like your disciples, or seriously stupid. You're one of my students too, Annie. So? She lunged at him then, trying to sweep his legs out from under him. Naruto laughed, and jumped over her sweep, his boots touching the small of her back as he sprang off and over her. For someone who claimed to be only human time and time again, he was certainly agile. Why in this world are the people most capable of opposing the Titans the only ones given the privilege of avoiding them entirely? She countered, grabbing his fist when he struck out at her stomach. How do you think it got to be such a farce? Who knows? Naruto grabbed her elbow in turn, twisting it behind her back. I'm only human. I can't possibly hope to understand such things. Then maybe it's just human nature. Maybe. He did something with his right leg then, she couldn't tell what. Whatever he'd done their spar ended the same as it always did, with her on the ground and him standing over her. Annie closed her eyes and sighed, her gaze drifting up into the cloudy afternoon sky. Another loss. She'd spared with Naruto a grand total of 50 times now, and never once had she come close to victory. It was humiliating. How could someone be so skilled in combat as to just brush her aside like that? Point is, I can't know. I won't even pretend to be stupid enough to play soldier in this insane world, never. Because of your mission? Naruto knew better than to mention the truth of what she was not with so many witnesses present. She wasn't quite as paranoid about it as she'd been 3 years before, but it still rankled her for him to discuss it so openly. Yeah, she retaliated, like I said, never, so stop trying to be nice to me. A hand thrust itself before her vision. Never say never, Annie. Sking softly to herself, she accepted his hand. And flashback. Naruto. Bakram. The building erupted around her as her titan form grew around her, sheathing her body in layers of superheated bone and muscle. Annie didn't wait for her new body to finish forming, nor did she stop to ponder on this sudden cause for her clarity. She was already bounding forward, into the rubble, smashing through buildings in a haste to get to her fellow blonde. She clenched her knuckles and willed them to harden, a flesh and bone fist becoming hard and stiff as she raced to greet the enemy. The first titan to meet her fist didn't know what had hit it. One moment, it had been gnawing upon Naruto's shoulder, the next, her diamond-hard knuckles launched it halfway across the town. In the face of this new and unexpected threat, the other titans began to turn, but too late. She was already amongst them, lashing out with overwhelming speed and precision. Her body was a raging hurricane, and the titans mere bricks and stones before her wrath, blown away into bloody pieces before her wrath. Rayarg! A furious scream left her lips and deafened her enemies, giving life to the maelstrom of emotion raging inside her chest. Kill! She'd kill them all for what they'd done, each and every one of them. Her mind slipped into a black haze. There were only the enemies before her, only the urge, the need to kill, so kill she did. She tore and ripped and ravaged everything in her path, tearing them away from the battered blonde in a series of swift submission holds and back-breaking blows. Between the two of them, the remaining titans didn't stand a chance, caught between the elegant female titan and the overwhelming speed and power of the six-armed titan. They found themselves swiftly eradicated, reduced to little more than gory smears upon the walls and buildings. Their slaughter seemed to last forever, when in reality, it probably lasted only a couple of minutes. They killed nearly 100 titans together in that square, moving with the teamwork established over the last 3 years. It felt wonderful, wonderful to resume her titan form, to throw herself into battle without pause or preamble, to decimate the enemy without thought or cause. And when it was finally over, when the blood of her foes stained the streets and sizzled in her hair, Annie finally allowed herself to think. Naruto turned to regard her, his red eyes wide with disbelief, or so she thought. Then they narrowed, and she could see the pride shimmering within those deep crimson depths, when he extended a clenched fist. Annie felt her heart skip a beat. After all this, was he actually? Good job, he ground out, still holding up his clenched knuckles. Despite herself, Annie laughed, and her titan body laughed with her. Baka. Tenderly, Annie returned the motion, bumping fists with him for the first time since they'd met. It was quite a comical sight. 2 titans bumping fists together, grinning like a pair of complete idiots. That wasn't far from the mark. She felt like a complete idiot just then, but it was the first time she'd smiled in what felt like forever, and it felt damned good. "Look out, Titans!" Annie caught motion out of the corner of her eye just then. Mikasa and the others had finally emerged from within the supply depots at long last, their tanks filled to the maximum. It was time for her to disappear while she still had the chance. She didn't need to rely on gas thanks in part to her wind affinity. She could climb the wall later at her leisure. She didn't have to worry about Eren's fate, either. Knowing Naruto, he would make certain that he done his utmost to residential right now. All that remained was to run. And so, she did. Annie raised one giant finger to her lips for silence. Then she bolted. Naruto didn't waste any time either. She saw him already sprinting towards Eren's prone Titan form and stabbing his hand into the neck, extracting him from the now shriveled-up corpse. Cries of shock and surprise rose up from his students, echoing in her ears as Annie didn't pay them any heed. She was far too focused on getting the hell out of here somewhere safe where she could shed her Titan form without anyone noticing that glaring sight of her female form. Shame flooded her as reality set in. Her moment of emotion might have cost her most dear, ruining her mission altogether, forever. Idiot! She was cursing herself even as she ran for the safety of the wall. Her transformation coming undone around her, she had to run. She had to get away and hide before someone other than Naruto finally made the connection between herself and the appearance of the female Titan. It was stupid, absurd. She'd risked exposure all to help him. What was she going to do when Reiner and Berholt found out? And they would find out. She knew this in her heart, because she'd seen them, and if she had seen them, then they'd seen her. By the gods, what had she done? What have I done?